Reaction to the 9/11 Commission report from families of victims, former intelligence officials, and authors. They look at the investigation's methodology, scope, and recommendations. This, the first of 2 parts, is about 3.5 hours. Part 2 airs Friday night at 8 Eastern.
Good morning. I'm Verna Avery Brown with the Washington Bureau Chief for Pacifica Radio. It's important that we note today's hearings are being held against the backdrop of yet another terrorist attack. Yesterday, 7 men carrying bombs in backpacks hit 3 subway trains and a double-decker bus in London. Fortunately, this time the bombs only partially detonated. 15 days ago, however, the outcome was far more devastating. 56 people and the attackers were killed. These recent attacks, albeit in London, serve as an all too painful reminder of the vulnerability of the world against terrorist attacks. Today, we're undertaking an examination, a critical examination of the 9/11 Commission that investigated the tragedy that befell this country on September 11, 2001. Resulting in the deaths of over 3,000 individuals. This briefing, hosted by the Honorable U.S. Representative Cynthia McKinney, whose courageous leadership around this issue is keeping the matter before the public eye until the American people feel the nagging questions have been adequately addressed. Welcome to the 9/11 Commission report 1 year later, a citizen's response. Did the Commission get it right? I now give you the Honorable Cynthia McKinney.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone for coming today to this briefing as we take a scrutinizing look at the 9/11 Commission final report on the anniversary of its publication and ask the question, did the commissioners get it right? I especially want to thank all of the panelists here today, some of whom have traveled across the Atlantic to be here. And I wish to point out that without the families of victims of 9/11, none of us would be here today to hear them, as we shall very shortly present their evaluation of the work of the 9/11 Commission. And that is because there would not have been any commission were it not for the stubborn refusal of family members of the victims of 9/11 to accept the silence and obstruction of the White House and Congress on this issue. And with us today, we have 2 of the Jersey girls, Mindy Kleinberg and Lori Van Auken, who lost their husbands, Alan and Kenneth, on 9/11, and who co-chaired the Family Steering Committee. Bob McIlvaine, who lost his son, Bobby, on September 11th, and who works with 911 families for peaceful tomorrows. And Marilyn Rosenthal, who lost her son, Josh, on September 11th. It is principally through the efforts of these and thousands more Americans whose families were touched by the tragedy of September 11th that this administration reluctantly agreed to establish the commission. Yet even once it was founded, the families had to fight to overcome underfunding and to extend unreasonably short deadlines. So when we talk of the 911 Commission and its report, we must first thank the families for their perseverance in seeing to it that any commission was assembled at all. We need to remind ourselves that this commission's task was to investigate the murder of nearly 3,000 persons. And while the commission published a final report, there is today widespread skepticism among the American public about the commission's report, and many voices are calling for keeping the investigation alive. Monica Gabriel lost her husband, and she is with us today, this morning, as a panelist. Within days of the attacks, we were told that the perpetrators were from a terrorist network known as Al-Qaeda. When reporters and members of the public asked for details, Then Secretary of State Colin Powell promised that it would be made all clear to the world in a white paper. Nearly 4 years and 2 wars later, we still have no official statement from the Bush administration on the specifics of who did it, who aided and financed them, or what their origins are. For the families who suffered so much loss, this surely feels like adding insult to injury. They deserve to know everything there is to be known about how their loved ones died. They fought for an investigation that would be nonpartisan, independent, and that would get to the bottom of things. But as work got underway, not only did the commission run up against obstruction by the administration and non-cooperation from government agencies, many, if not most, of the commissioners themselves had conflicts of interest. And several commissioners spoke out about problems in the process. The lack of investigative rigor and heavy reliance on previous work, the Joint Commission report, the drafting of recommendations before the investigative process got rolling, the failure to take testimony under oath, or in many cases, to even take transcripts. As the original deadline approached, the Commission's work was half done, and only after the families fought for it was the deadline extended. Then last year, we got the final report, an extensive, prosaically impressive report. But as some of us sat down to read it, the errors and omissions immediately jumped out at us. How was it that it took over an hour after the first transponder went off before planes were scrambled to meet the threat, all of them too late? What happened to those reports that surfaced within months of September 11th stating that 7 or more of the alleged hijackers had come forward and claimed that they were victims of stolen identities and were alive and well, living in Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and Tunisia? Why did the Commission choose not even to address this? What about the terrorist Omar Saeed Sheikh, now sitting in a Pakistani prison on charges of participating in the kidnapping and murder of Wall Street journalist Daniel Pearl? According to Indian intelligence, this man received orders from a Pakistani general to transfer $100,000 to Muhammad Atta. People all over the world are talking about this story, but not a word about it in the report. What about Osama bin Laden and his role in the Mujahideen backed by the CIA in the 1980s to fight the Soviets? The Commission didn't go there. This morning, we will be hearing about these omissions, errors, and about the historical background of September 11th from the collection of experts we have assembled. In the afternoon, we will be looking at the report's recommendations, and I think we will find very little in them that challenges the Bush administration's foreign policy and its war on terrorism. In fact, its recommendations for centralizing America's intelligence networks seems designed to further that agenda. And we will be hearing about how under the Patriot Act and the dual legal system that has been enacted to allow detainees to be held indefinitely without facing judge or jury, how our civil liberties are being eroded in the name of fighting the terrorists, as if the term terrorist alone tells us all we need to know about our enemies. We need to know about our enemies if we're going to reclaim a future free from the fear of terrorist attacks and weapons of mass destruction. We cannot afford to shy away from inconvenient truths. Many of you may find what you hear today to be inconvenient information. But Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but times of challenge and controversy." I encourage you to engage with the issues that are raised. And if you don't agree or don't like what you hear, challenge it. I believe that we should take in what every reasonable person has to say to inform our decisions, because that's the best way to find the truth. And in our pursuit of the truth, I encourage you to emulate the courage and the determination of the September 11th families in their struggle to know what really happened. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Congresswoman McKinney. This morning, we are going to seat 4 panels during our morning session. We will hear from the family's report as the first panel. The second panel will be behind the 9/11 Commission, Flaws in the Process, a staff report, and a citizen's critique. The third panel will be focused on omissions and errors in the Commission's final report. And the fifth, 9/11 in historical perspective, flawed assumptions, the underground world of terrorist financing. We'll take a short break for lunch at that time, and then we'll seat an afternoon panel. So we'd like to begin with our first panel of guests. Laurie Van Oken, a member of the 9/11 Family Steering Committee. Laurie's husband, Kenneth, was killed in the attacks upon the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Kenneth Van Oken, 47 years old, worked for Canton Fitzgerald on the 105th floor of Tower 1. Van Oken served as co-chair of the Family Steering Committee for the 9/11 Independent Commission, and with fellow widows Mindy Kleinberg, Christine Breitweiser, and Patty Kazasa, Ms. Van Oken helped to found September 11th Advocates. Together, these women put aside their grief, knocked on doors, and twisted arms until Congress and the President agreed to form an independent commission to investigate how the attacks happened. They refused to give up until even the most reluctant players bared their presidential daily briefs. The iron determination of the Jersey Girls, as they've come to be known as, earned them national and international notoriety. Unsatisfied with many aspects of the 9/11 Commission and its report, they continued to press for accountability and refused to accept that what happened was simply a failure of processes and organizations and not people. Mindy Kleinberg is a widow to husband Alan, killed in the attacks upon the World Trade Center on September 11th. Alan Kleinberg, 39, worked for Cantor Fitzgerald on the 104th floor of the World Trade Center, Tower 1. Kleinberg served as co-chair of the Family Steering Committee for the 9/11 Independent Commission, and again with fellow widows Laurie Van Oken, Christine Breitweiser, and Patty Kazasa, Ms. Kleinberg helped to found September 11th Advocates. And Monica Gabriel is also joining us. She lost her husband in the attacks as well. We're going to have a prayer as well to bless these proceedings before we move forward. And I would like to invite Pastor West to deliver the blessings.
Let us pray. Creator of the universe, we, your people, are gathered here from far and near, the north, the south, east and west, seeking your truth. Some of us come with pain and sorrow, seeking relief, knowing that relief will come only when your truth is revealed to us. Some of us come out of fear that we will experience yet another 9/11. Send us your words of truth that will drive away all of our fears. Some of us are here because there's a void in our lives, knowing that only your truth will remove that void. No matter why we're here, we're all here for one common desire. This is to have the truth, the real truth, revealed to us. Thank you for those who planned this session. For as mortals, we know what is required of us: to do justice and walk humbly with our God. As we do justice and walk humbly with you, we pause, this morning to remember those who died, those who were injured, and families and friends who are seeking healing and wholeness. Let us be silent and remember those. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor West. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. I'd like to ask everyone to turn off their cell phones. I know it's painful, but we'd like for you to do so. We have reserved seating in the front for family members, so if there are family members here who are not sitting in the front, we invite you to assume your seat there. Congressional staff and members and the press as well. When you're speaking, you will be sitting on the lower dais with the other panelists and facing the audience. Also, we're having a timekeeper this morning. They will keep our busy agendas on track, and they'll also help us to keep the speakers on track as well. So we'll ask the speakers to keep an eye on our timekeeper over here. If you raise your hand, he'll be giving us signals, and when you hear the bells, you'll know that you have at least 2 minutes left to conclude your remarks. Lunch and accommodations at 1 p.m., and all are invited to a lunch at Representative McKinney's office in Cannon House Office Building, room 320. We'd like to also welcome all of the Congress people that are here with us this morning. Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't notice that I had been joined by my sister, Congresswoman Carolyn Kilpatrick from Detroit, Michigan.
Good morning. Good morning. So we'll begin our discussion this morning now with representatives from the families. Laurie Van Oken. Good morning, Laurie.
Good morning. My name is Laurie Van Auken. I am speaking today on behalf of 9/11 widows Monica Gabriel and Mindy Kleinberg, who are here with me today. On the morning of September 11th, my husband Kenneth was killed while at his office on the 105th floor of the North Tower at the World Trade Center. We extend our sincere thanks to you, Representative McKinney, as well as to all of those who are responsible for setting up this hearing and giving us this opportunity today. On the morning of September 11th, I received the following message from my husband, Kenneth.
Brenda, could you close the door so we can hear a little better?
Old messages. I love you. I'm in the World Trade Center. The building was hit by something. I don't know if I'm going to get out, but I love you very much. I hope I'll see you later. Bye. End of messages.
From his words, I knew that Ken survived the impact of the plane. So I tried to call him back, but there was no answer. I fell to my knees in a panic, still clutching the telephone. A moment later, when the phone rang, it startled me completely. I prayed that it was Ken, but it was my mother. She told me to turn the television on. I told her about Ken's message. I told her that I couldn't reach him. I told her that I was very scared. I watched the TV in utter horror as black smoke billowed out from the building through a gaping hole the size of an airplane. I knew that Kenny was in that building. I watched as the people ran from the World Trade Center, hoping for a glimpse of my husband. Then the second tower was hit. As I continued to watch the breaking news, they showed the president sitting in an elementary school classroom, juxtaposed with the footage of the black smoke coming from the World Trade Center, along with people jumping to their deaths from the burning buildings. I screamed at the television, "Get up, President Bush, get up and do something." But he remained seated in a classroom of small children. I watched as Andrew Card whispered something to the president, and yet, still my president remained seated in a classroom of small children when our country was so obviously under a terrorist attack. In between panic and hysteria, in between hoping that my husband would get out of the World Trade Center alive, and wondering how I would ever break this news to my children, I also wondered why the Secret Service was letting the President stay in the classroom full of children. Why didn't they whisk him away? It seemed as if every target in America was being attacked. So wasn't the President, the leader of the free world, in danger of being fatally attacked as well? Weren't the children who were in the classroom with the President in danger too? After 2 days and hundreds of phone calls to New York City hospitals and to the Red Cross, receiving no guidance and absolutely no answers, my husband's employer, Howard Lutnick, the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, recounted on a news program that no one who was in the offices of Cantor Fitzgerald at the time of the attacks had survived. That meant that Ken was gone. My looming and painful question as to whether or not my husband had survived was now answered. We now knew that the time for hoping was over. Our lives were forever changed. My children would never again see their father, and I was now a widow. The grieving was just beginning. With what felt like a gaping hole in my heart, with 2 traumatized teens to now raise alone, I wondered if I would ever feel like eating or breathing again. For me, one horribly sad question had been answered, but many more questions would soon follow. The questions began to gnaw at me slowly at first. I wondered how on earth almost 2 hours could have passed with 4 domestic commercial airplanes flying around the skies of America without a response from our military. I began to Google search and read whatever articles and timelines I could get my hands on. Once I began my research into 9/11, I found it hard to leave the computer. Because I was unable to sleep and because I needed desperately to reconstruct and understand the events of 9/11, it began to appear to those close to me that I was shackled to the computer, and I have to admit, in a manner of speaking, I was. Having connected with a few other widows, it was not long before we were all researching the events, while we waited for an official inquiry into the attacks to be initiated. Then the news came. Only intelligence agency failures would be examined. How could that be? Our husbands were killed at their desks when commercial airplanes flew into their office buildings. They had no means of escaping and had practically no chance of evacuating on 9/11. The buildings that were supposedly so magnificently designed had collapsed in minutes. Why would the investigation of our loved ones' murders be limited to only intelligence agencies? What about airline security, high-rise building security, and border security? What about the FAA, the Port Authority, the Secret Service, and NORAD, all of whom were partly to blame for the failures that allowed the 9/11 attacks to occur? Didn't those areas and entities need to be investigated too? Incredulous, but undeterred, we realized that it was necessary to take a thorough and independent look at what had gone wrong on 9/11. Our children were going to have to grow up in this changed world, and we needed to make sure that this could never happen again. We knew that with the 3,000 deaths on 9/11, there remained thousands of questions that needed to be answered. So we fought for the creation of the 9/11 Commission, and with all of America by our side, we finally won that battle. The Commission was passed into law in the autumn of 2002, and by January 2003, the Commission finally sat down to commence its very important work. The 9/11 Commission's report is 1 year old today. This report was supposed to provide the definitive account of what had transpired on September 11, 2001. We hoped that our thousands of unanswered questions would be addressed and answered. Yet incredibly, we have found that the Commission's definitive final report has actually yielded more questions than answers. Moreover, there are still so many areas that remain unexplained or only vaguely touched upon by the 9/11 Commission, so much so that it was quite difficult for me to decide where I should start my testimony to you today. 1. The timeline of 9/11, the story of seismic information. I will begin with what I had first hoped for from the Commission. I believed that we needed the official timeline, the official and definitive timeline for 9/11. One of my questions had to do with the time that Flight 93 officially crashed. The Commission report says United 93 crashed in Pennsylvania at 10:03:11 a.m. and adds that the precise crash time has been the subject of dispute. In footnote 168 of Chapter 1, it says, quote, "We also reviewed a report regarding seismic observations on September 11, 2001, whose authors concluded that the impact time of United 93 was 10:06:05. Seismic data reflects the time that the Earth shook in response to the crash. Atomic clocks are used to record this data. I personally spoke with the men whose names appear on the seismic data report from 9/11. They received calls from the 9/11 Commission, too. I asked the seismologists, unless data existed that showed that the Earth also shook at 10:03 a.m., how could the Commission affix the time of Flight 93's crash to 10:03? They couldn't give me an answer, nor apparently could the Commissioners in their final report. The crash of Flight 93 is one of the major events of 9/11. If we couldn't figure out what time that crash occurred, how could we ever understand the real complexities of the day? Perhaps most alarmingly, what does this say about the quality of the rest of the work product in the final report if the Commission could not accurately isolate this easily defined piece of information? 2. Warnings, the story of ignored warnings by individuals. At 1:47 p.m. on September 11, 2001, while aboard Air Force One, Ari Fleischer was asked the following question by press briefing pool. Quote, "Had there been any warnings that the President knew of?" Close quote. Mr. Fleischer answered simply, quote, "No warnings." No warnings. From my simple research using Google on my home computer, I learned that there were plenty of warnings. For example, newspapers in England, France, Germany, and Russia reported that there were indeed many warnings delivered to the Bush administration throughout the spring and summer of 2001. German intelligence warned both American and Israeli agencies that terrorists might be planning to hijack commercial aircraft to use them as weapons and to attack important American targets. During the G8 summit in Genoa, Italy, during the month of July 2001, Egypt warned of a plot to use airplanes to attack President Bush while he was there for the summit. As an aside, this warning was taken so seriously that anti-aircraft missiles were deployed near the Columbus airport in Italy. Even ABC News reported Bush administration officials acknowledged that U.S. intelligence officials informed President Bush weeks before the September 11th attacks that bin Laden's terrorist network might try to hijack American planes. Likewise, Newsweek reported that as many as 10 to 12 warnings were issued, and more than 2 of the warnings specifically mentioned the possibilities of hijackings. Similarly, George Tenet was issuing many warnings that bin Laden was the most immediate threat to Americans. Indeed, the al-Qaeda warnings were dire enough in May of 2001 to motivate President Bush to appoint Vice President Cheney to head a task force to combat terrorist attacks on the United States. As reported by the Washington Post, President Bush said that Vice President Cheney would direct a government-wide review on managing the consequences of a domestic terrorist attack. And Vice President Cheney was quoted as saying, "I will periodically chair a meeting of the National Security Council to review these efforts." But according to the Washington Post, neither Cheney's review nor Bush's took place. The 9/11 report chose not to address any of the aforementioned warnings, and thus, in my opinion, did not answer the most important question, which was, with all of these warnings, why were we still so ill-prepared? 3. Dots Not Connected, the story of David Frasca. It would seem that the Radical Fundamentalist Unit, the RFU, at FBI headquarters was in receipt of various pieces of information that, if put together, should have allowed them to see that a threatening pattern involving persons of interest was emerging during the summer of 2001. For example, the RFU was in receipt of both the Phoenix memo, the FBI memo that suggested there was a pattern of suspicious activity involving large numbers of Arab men taking flying lessons in American flight schools, and the FBI's file on Zacharias Moussaoui, an Arab man who was enrolled in an American flight school and fit the profile of a terrorist. While the 9/11 Commission goes into much detail about the facts surrounding the Phoenix memo and the case of Zacharias Moussaoui, they do not mention perhaps the most damning of all facts involving both issues, namely that it was only 2 individuals at the RFU who received the Phoenix memo and the Moussaoui information within weeks of each other. They subsequently, and detrimentally, blocked not only the dissemination of this information within the community, but also stymied further requested avenues of investigation within the community of such pieces of vital information. The 9/11 Commission summarily blames the failure to connect the 2 dots of the Phoenix memo and Zacharias Moussaui's file on the FBI's institutional misunderstanding of the Reno Wall and the agency's inherent inability to share information across and throughout its ranks. What is missing from this analysis and rather facile conclusion is that it was two individuals who worked together and not a misunderstanding of the Reno Wall that is to blame for the failure of the FBI to receive a FISA warrant in the case of Zacarias Moussaoui. It is likewise those same individuals who are responsible for the Phoenix memo being downplayed and all but ignored. FBI Supervisor David Frasca and his underling Michael Maltby not only failed to permit FBI agents to request a FISA warrant for Moussaoui, but also altered the agent's initial request for it. Specifically, on August 28, 2001, Maltby edited the Minnesota FBI's request for a FISA warrant to search Zacarias Moussaoui's possessions. The Minnesota FBI field office wanted to prove that Moussaoui was connected to Al-Qaeda through a rebel group in Chechnya, but the RFU agent Maltby removed the information connecting the Chechen rebels to Al-Qaeda. Subsequently, the FBI Deputy General Counsel who received the edited request, scrubbed clean of any international terrorist ties, decided that there wasn't enough of a connection between Moussaoui and Al-Qaeda to allow an application for a search warrant through FISA. Thus, a FISA warrant was never even applied for. Later, in a report released on June 9, 2005, the FBI's Inspector General's office, far from downplaying this exchange, cited a top FBI lawyer's statement that, quote, he had never seen a supervisory special agent in headquarters so adamant that a FISA warrant could not be obtained, and at the same time, a field office so adamant that it could, close quote. The report also noted that the Minneapolis field office sought an expedited FISA, which it explained normally involved reports of suspected imminent attack or other imminent danger. To reiterate, the first memo the supervisor of the Radical Fundamentalist Unit, David Frasca, received warned that Osama bin Laden was probably coordinating efforts to send men for flight training, the Phoenix memo, and only a few weeks later, Frasca received a file on a suspicious individual, Moussaoui, actually training at a flight school. In essence, the Moussaoui case was actual confirmation of the Phoenix memo's prediction. And it was these same men, Frasca and Maltby, who not only thwarted the efforts of FBI agents to get a FISA warrant to search Moussaoui's belongings, including his laptop that had information leading to other 9/11 hijackers, but it was also Frasca and Maltby who tampered with the papers requesting a FISA warrant. Moussaoui's laptop was finally searched after the 9/11 attacks. German telephone numbers were found, as was the name Ahad Sabet. The numbers led the FBI to determine that the name Ahad Sabet was an alias for Ramzi bin al-Shibh, former roommate of Mohammed Atta, the pilot of American Airlines Flight 11, which crashed into Tower 1, my husband's building, on 9/11. Agents also discovered that Ramzi bin al-Shibh had wired money to Moussaoui in the summer of 2001. In addition, they found a document connecting Moussaoui with the Malaysian Yazid Sufat, a connection that could have led them to 9/11 hijackers, Khalid al-Madore and Nawaf Al-Hazmi. Those were two of the hijackers said to have crashed Flight 77 into the Pentagon. Both al-Madore and Al-Hazmi lived in San Diego, California, had their names blatantly published in the San Diego phone book, and had contacts with individuals under FBI investigation. At the time of Moussaoui's arrest, one FBI agent commented in his case notes quite prophetically that Moussaoui seemed like a man who was capable of flying airplanes into the World Trade Center. Sadly, the FBI agents were trying their best to follow these leads, but for some unknown reason, FBI headquarters thwarted their own agents instead of thwarting the terrorists. While several entries refer to Moussaoui in the Commission's final report, the Commission fails to discuss the Moussaoui case in a comprehensive manner. For example, how could the Commission fail to mention that it was these two men, David Frasca and Michael Maltby at the FBI's Radical Fundamentalist Unit, who received the Phoenix memo and then thwarted attempts to acquire a FISA warrant for Moussaoui's computer? How could the Commission remain silent on this matter when these men, Frasca and Maltby, have since been promoted within the FBI? Why didn't the Commission apply the axiom that an agency is only as good as the people who work for it? To quote Senator Shelby, they continue to reward bad behavior, and the results speak for themselves. By leaving this highly relevant fact unaddressed, The Commission lays bare that its conclusion about the need for intelligence community reforms is half-baked at best and hollow at worst. 4. The Hamburg Cell, the story of Marwin and a phone number. Had David Frasca and Michael Maltby not altered the FISA application, it is likely that the FBI would have discovered that the members of the notorious Hamburg Cell. The Hamburg Al-Qaeda cell was central to the 9/11 plot. Members of this cell included lead hijacker Mohammed Atta, who is said to have piloted Flight 11, 9/11 hijacker Ziad Jarrah, 9/11 hijacker Marwan al-Shehi, who is said to have piloted Flight 175, and Ramzi bin al-Shib, who wired money to the hijackers. Further proof of the significance of the Hamburg cell can be found in the fact that in March 1999, Marwan al-Shehi had already caught the attention of German intelligence officials who were monitoring the telephone of Mohammed Haidar Zamar, an Islamic extremist in Hamburg, who was closely linked to important al-Qaeda plotters who ultimately masterminded the 9/11 attacks. The German intelligence officials gave the Central Intelligence Agencies the first name of Marwan and his telephone number in the United Arab Emirates and asked CIA to track him. Nevertheless, according to the official record, CIA did nothing with this information. Close surveillance of Marwan al-Shehi in 1999 would have revealed his early connections to Flight 11 hijacker Mohammed Atta, who was Mr. al-Shehi's roommate at the time. Both men had also attended the wedding of a fellow Muslim at a radical mosque in Hamburg of October 1999, an event considered to be significant for the September 11th hijacking teams because it occurred at a time when the 9/11 plot was taking shape. Yet the requested surveillance on Marwan never happened. It would seem that the director of the CIA at the time, George Tenet, did not feel that they had enough information to be able to track down this terrorist. He has stated, quote, "The Germans gave us a name, Marwan, that's it, and a phone number." The director of Central Intelligence replied, adding, "They didn't give us a first and last name until after 9/11. It seems unbelievable that with a first name and a phone number, the CIA would not have even attempted to follow up on this lead. As columnist Maureen Dowd wrote, quote, for crying out loud, as one guy I know put it, I've tracked down women across the country with a lot less information than that." Although Philip Zelikow, the 9/11 Commission staff director, was quoted as having said, "The Hamburg cell is very important to the investigation of the September 11th attacks," and "Intelligence on Mr. al-Shehi is an issue that's obviously of importance to us, and we're investigating it," on February 24, 2004, when asked whether American intelligence officials gave sufficient attention to the information about Mr. al-Shehi, Mr. Zelikow continued to say, "We haven't reached any conclusions." 5 months later, when the Commission released its final report, no further conclusion or explanation for the CIA's failure to follow the German lead was noted. Why did the Commission ignore this important piece of information and the CIA's failure to act on it? 5. Watchlisting issues, a story of surveillance. An area that was addressed more thoroughly in the 9/11 Commission's final report was the matter of Pentagon Flight 77 hijackers Khalid al-Madore and Nawaf Al-Hazmi. However, because much of the information on these two important characters is found in the minute text of the Commission's report footnotes, learning the details requires a magnifying glass. The Commission failed to explain how and why the CIA dropped the ball with information it acquired about the January 2000 terrorist summit in Malaysia. It has been reported that the 9/11 attacks and the USS Cole bombings were planned at this meeting. In attendance were key Cole bomber Khalid bin Atash and two of the would-be 9/11 hijackers, Khalid al-Madore and Nawaf al-Hazmi. Although the CIA identified the men as suspected extremists via their participation in the meeting with the identified Cole bombing suspect, the CIA inexplicably failed to request that the two men be placed on the government's watch list until late August 2001. By that time, both al-Madore and al-Hazmi were already in the United States. And even though the men were living in San Diego listed by their correct names in the local phone book, and their landlord was an FBI informant, the Bureau stated that it did not learn of their whereabouts until after 9/11. From the footnotes of the 9/11 Commission report, we learn that the CIA intentionally kept the FBI out of the loop with regard to these two hijackers who were living in this country. Had someone in the CIA made the decision to not inform the FBI about these two 9/11 hijackers? And if so, why did the 9/11 Commission bury it in a footnote and not address why such action was taken? The purposeful withholding of vital information by one intelligence agency from another intelligence agency is a type of failure that cannot be corrected or masked through simple reorganizational reforms of the intelligence community. Even a plain reading of the footnote detailing the CIA's dubious behavior raises serious questions that beg to be answered. In July 2005, in response to the 9/11 public discourse hearing on intelligence agencies, we wrote a press release that included the following information with regard to Chapter 6, quote, called From Threat to Threat. Footnote number 44. Footnote number 44 details an instance where a CIA desk officer intentionally withheld vital information from the FBI about two of the 9/11 hijackers who were inside the United States. This footnote further states that the CIA desk officer covered up the decision to withhold said vital information from the FBI. Finally, footnote number 44 states that the CIA desk officer could not recall who told her to carry out such acts. While several notable instances of this sort of intentional withholding of vital information from and among intelligence agencies are found throughout the 9/11 Commission's final report, we called special attention to 4 additional examples in our press release. We did so with the hope that the 9/11 commissioners would now explain why the truth has not been revealed to the American public about one of our intelligence agencies' ongoing surveillance of the 9/11 hijackers while they were living inside the United States in the 18 months leading up to the 9/11 attacks. The leads to Madore and Al-Hazmi in San Diego were key, but perhaps even more relevant was the earlier gleaned information about Marwan al-Shayhi, because that information would have immediately unearthed the existence of the Hamburg Cell, the epicenter from which the 9/11 plot was prepared. According to testimony given in Germany after the 9/11 attacks, al-Shayhi was one of only 4 members of the Hamburg Cell who knew about the 9/11 attacks beforehand. Marwan al-Shayhi and Mohammed Atta traveled to Afghanistan in 2000 to train at an al-Qaeda training camp with several other September 11th plotters, and after returning to Germany, al-Shayhi made an ominous reference regarding the World Trade Center to a Hamburg librarian saying, "There will be thousands of dead. You will all think of me," German authorities said. Soon afterward, Atta, al-Shayhi, and another plotter, Zia Jarrah, began emailing several dozen American flight schools from Germany to inquire about enrollment. They arrived in the United States later in 2000 to begin flight training. In its final report, the Commission continues to perpetuate the myth that the CIA's failure to communicate with the FBI was some sort of institutional failure, and thus readily fixable by intelligence community reforms. That notion is extremely harmful to our nation. Why didn't the Commission address the intentional lack of communication between the CIA and the FBI? 6. Planes as Missiles, the story of the PDB. In spite of many explicit warnings, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice claimed that the administration was never warned of an attack before 9/11. She went on national TV and stated, "I don't think anybody could have predicted that they would try to use an airplane as a missile, a hijacked airplane as a missile." However, as previously recounted, there were many warnings that terrorists might use planes as missiles. How could the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States not have been aware of this possibility? Further, why, if this was indeed a breakdown of communication within the executive branch of our government, wasn't that addressed by the Commission? If the vital flow of information from the agencies to the National Security Advisor was somehow hampered, wouldn't we need to understand how and why this was in order to make sure that the proper channels of information to and from the executive branch were operational in the future? While Condoleezza Rice seems to have failed in her capacity as National Security Advisor to inform President Bush of such warnings, there were many others within the President's cadre of advisors who also could have apprised him of the same information. Yet, on 5/17/02, President Bush also seemed to have no idea about the threat, saying, "Had I known that the enemy was going to use airplanes to kill on that fateful morning, I would have done everything in my power to protect the American people." And to our further dismay, when Condoleezza Rice testified before the Commission in April of 2004, we learned that on August 6, 2001, the President had been briefed by the CIA about just such a possibility. Although Ms. Rice argued during her testimony that the Presidential Daily Brief of August 6, 2001 was historical in nature and didn't warn of a domestic threat, the title of the PDB was Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the United States. The title alone reveals that the document did indeed refer to a domestic threat and was, in fact, not a historical recap. At one point, to clarify and dispel the purely historical argument, I color-coded the PDB so that everyone could see exactly what parts of the PDB said that the threat was both domestic and current. I have done the same for this hearing. The orange is the domestic threat, and where it's yellow, highlighted in yellow, it's in the present tense. It's current on both pages. An example of the current and domestic threat in the text of the August 6, 2001 PDB was the statement, "Nevertheless, FBI information since that time indicates patterns of suspicious activity in this country consistent with preparation for hijackings or other types of attacks, including recent surveillance of federal buildings in New York." Why did the 9/11 Commission fail to call Ms. Rice to account for her deliberately misleading public statements? Why wouldn't the Commission address the discrepancies between the sworn testimony and uncovered facts? Not holding witnesses accountable for the veracity of their sworn testimony undermines the process. 7. Patterns of hijacking, the story of 52 warnings. We also hope that the 9/11 Commission would explain the patterns of hijacking language found in the PDB. Where did this information come from? Perhaps it originated with the FAA. The explanation was not found in the final report released on July 22, 2004. But months later, when the second monograph was finally made public that the Commission had produced, we learned that there had been actually 52 warnings issued by the FAA during the 6 months preceding 9/11. So when on September 11, 2001, Ari Fleischer, the White House press secretary, said there were no warnings, what could he have possibly meant? And what exactly did our government do with the 52 warnings it received during the summer of 2001? If nothing was done with regard to said warnings, why was that? And whose job was it to make sure that appropriate defensive action was taken? At the very least, directives could have been issued to airport screeners to be on the lookout for certain types of suspicious behaviors. On February 11, 2005, in response to the Commission's release of its FAA monograph, we sent out another press release. We stated, "Notably missing from this monograph is any information pertaining to NORAD's failure to scramble jets in a timely manner, which leads us to wonder what else is being withheld from the public." We went on to state, of the 105 warnings issued, 52 warnings regarding Al-Qaeda were given to the FAA by the intelligence community in a 6-month period from April 2001 to September 2001. According to the 9/11 Commission's final report, there were 8 information circulars put out by the FAA between July 2nd and September 10th, 2001. 5 of these information circulars targeted overseas threats, while the remaining 3 targeted domestic threats. And finally, we stated, the 52 threats regarding Al-Qaeda were not received by the FAA in a vacuum. From March 2001 to September 2001, according to the Joint Inquiry of Congress, our intelligence community received at least 41 specific threats of a possible domestic attack by Al-Qaeda. Additionally, the FAA was also made aware of the August 15, 2001 arrest of Zacarias Moussaoui. And finally, the FAA attended a high-level meeting on July 5, 2001, where the domestic threat posed by Al-Qaeda was discussed by all relevant intelligence agencies. The FAA monograph reveals that in the spring of 2001, the FAA had already determined that if the intent of the hijacker is not to exchange hostages for prisoners, but to commit suicide in a spectacular explosion, a domestic hijacking would probably be preferable. It would seem that during the summer of 2001, there were indeed enough warnings and concern that all agencies should have been put on alert. Action should have and could have been taken. Nevertheless, the 9/11 commissioners never once reflected upon whose job it was to coordinate all those pieces of evidence. They also left unaddressed the fact that with all this information floating throughout the agencies in the summer of 2001, why didn't our National Security Council convene to discuss the very pertinent, very relevant issue of terrorism until September 4th, 2001, a mere 7 days before 9/11? 8, accountability, the story of the lack thereof. To date, no one has ever been held accountable for 9/11. Government officials who failed in their jobs were promoted and given medals. Terrorists have yet to be indicted or successfully prosecuted. Even the so-called masterminds, Ramzi bin al-Shibh and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, have yet to be prosecuted, and Osama bin Laden is still on the loose, evading capture. When we learned that German prosecutor Dr. Krauss was scheduled to testify before the 9/11 Commission in June of 2004, I wrote the following email and sent it off to the commissioners. I am especially interested in learning what the German prosecutor Dr. Krauss thought about the U.S. government not turning over people such as Ramzi bin al-Shibh or transcripts of his interrogation, who was reportedly in U.S. custody at a secure location. This lack of cooperation by the U.S. government made it impossible for the German courts to successfully prosecute Mr. Mazzoudi, who was put on trial in Germany for crimes related to 9/11. Dr. Krauss never did testify before the Commission. Our questions for him regarding the lack of cooperation between the U.S. government and the German government, which led to the release of suspected terrorist Mazzoudi and Matasadek, also remain unanswered. The Commission's report only tells us that Mazzoudi and Matasadek witnessed the execution of Mohammed Atta's will. If these two men were truly involved in the 9/11 plot, why didn't the U.S. government turn over all of the evidence in their possession in order to convict these two men? Why would our government refuse to cooperate with the German government in order to help incarcerate such known terrorists? Why did the 9/11 Commission report fail to address this in a substantive manner? And more pointedly, how will we ever win the war on terror without prosecuting and holding terrorists accountable? 9. Air defense, the story of NORAD's belated response. In other defense capacities on the morning of 9/11, the Commission's report discusses the actions of the FAA, NORAD, and NEADS. In particular, I make reference to footnote number 116, page 458, which says that on 9/11, NORAD was scheduled to conduct a military exercise, Vigilant Guardian, which postulated a bomber attack from the former Soviet Union. We investigated whether military preparations for the large-scale exercise compromised the military's response to the real-world terrorist attack on 9/11. Accordingly, the newly sworn-in Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Eberhart, said that it took the military about 30 seconds to make the adjustment to the real-world situation. But the following words, which show there was confusion, have troubled me since my research began. Needs. This comes from the Commission report and from the day of 9/11 transcripts. Needs. Is this real world or exercise? FAA. No, this is not an exercise, not a test. On page 20, we note more confusion. Needs did not know where to send the alert fighter aircraft, and the officer directing the fighters pressed for more information. Quote, I don't know where I'm scrambling these guys to. I need a direction, a destination, close quote. And on page 26, NORAD heard nothing about the search for American 77. Instead, the NEADS air defenders heard renewed reports about a plane that no longer existed, American 11. At 9:21, NEADS received a report from the FAA. FAA, Military Boston Center. I just had a report that American 11 is still in the air and on its way heading toward Washington. Needs. Okay, American 11 is still in the air? FAA, yes. Needs. On its way toward Washington? FAA, it was evidently another aircraft that hit the tower. That's the latest report we have. Needs. Okay. FAA, I'm going to try to confirm an ID for you, but I would assume he's somewhere over New Jersey or somewhere further south. Needs. Okay, so American 11 isn't the hijack at all then? FAA, no, he's a hijack. Needs. American 11 is a hijack? FAA, yes. Needs. And he's heading into Washington? FAA, yes. This could be a third aircraft. The mention of a third aircraft was not a reference to American 77. As the Commission report says, there was confusion at that moment in the FAA. And General Eberhardt's claim that the military exercises somehow made the military better prepared on 9/11 does not ring true. Instead, it appears that the concurrent military exercises completely confused everyone. Flight 11 was the flight that hit the first building at the World Trade Center in New York City. Thus far, we are still waiting for the monograph on the failures of NORAD that the Commission said it would produce. 10. Toothless investigation, the story of subpoena power not used. While the Department of Defense and others were threatened with subpoenas for not being forthcoming with information requested, we were of the mindset that all known evidence pertaining to September 11th should have been subpoenaed by the Commission from the outset with no exceptions. No stone, which, by the way, was also the mandate of the 9/11 Commission. No stone should have remained unturned, and yet this was not the case. For example, with regard to videos that recorded the Pentagon crash, we knew of at least 3 versions of videos that showed the crash of Flight 77, yet only one version ever made its way into the public domain. That version had the date stamp of 9/12 instead of 9/11/01. The timestamps repeated on 2 of the 5 frames, while the other times on the frames were missing. We had read in National Geographic about the second video that was recorded by cameras located at the Sheraton Hotel overlooking the Pentagon. We also read about the third video recording that showed the crash from the nearby Nexcom gas station's security camera. We asked the Commission, specifically Team 8, to subpoena for these videos, and just before the Commission released its final report, we met with some of them. They told us that they had not subpoenaed for this evidence, but had instead issued document requests, which were never answered. This seeming lack of persistence on the part of the Commission to collect all known evidence is worrisome. Again, if in fact they were unwilling to go after easily attainable evidence, what other critical and more difficult pieces of the story were they missing? How was one to feel comfortable with their investigation knowing that they were not aggressively pursuing the most tangible of evidence or information? Also missing from the Commission's definitive report is testimony from national security whistleblowers who had tried to testify before the Commission, but were either not asked to testify, or their testimony was only barely acknowledged, or worse yet, completely omitted from the record. This list includes Robert Wright, FBI agent, whom the FBI refused to allow to testify, and the Commission did not subpoena him. John M. Cole, FBI counterintelligence, who had pertinent information with regard to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the 9/11 attacks. He notified the 9/11 Commission during its tenure, but never received a response back from them. Coleen Rowley, FBI Division Counsel. The FBI Commission did not interview her and chose instead to rely on transcripts from the Joint Senate-House Intelligence Inquiry. Mike German, FBI Counterintelligence. In February 2004, his name and contact information were provided to the Commission as a key witness, but they never called him to testify. Mark Burton, Senior Analyst at NSA. He provided dozens of pages of information and testimony to the 9/11 Commission, but was ignored and was never invited to testify. Behruz Sashar, Language Specialist at the FBI. He was refused twice by the Commission to testify, but finally did testify. However, his testimony was omitted from the final report. This list is in no way complete. Rather, it is just a small sample of legitimate witnesses or corroborators of valuable 9/11-related information that they tried to provide to the Commission, but they were instead turned away. Knowing full well that the best source of how an agency really works would entail talking to the people who actually work there, why is it that the Commission refused these key witnesses an opportunity to tell what they knew? How could the Commission be trusted to make the right decisions without obtaining all pertinent information? Worse yet, what happens when the Commission actively and knowingly ignores that information? One whistleblower that we made sure the Commission met with was FBI translator Sibel Edmonds. It was only when we walked her into the Commission's offices that they agreed to hear what she had to say. Sibel is here. Once the report was released, Sibel read it with great hope. Disappointed in the Commission's failure to address her very real concerns, she wrote in an open letter, Quote, "Unfortunately, I find your report seriously flawed in its failure to address serious intelligence issues that I am aware of, which have been confirmed, and which, as a witness to the Commission, I have made you aware of. Thus, I must assume that other serious issues that I am not aware of were in the same manner omitted from your report. These omissions cast doubt on the validity of your report and therefore on its conclusions and recommendations." Close quote. A thorough and definitive investigation by the Commission would have addressed all of her concerns and spoken to all of the whistleblowers. It would have subpoenaed for the information it required and examined the plethora of information that other citizens and groups responsibly provided. And finally, without compromising our national security, it would have reported all of its findings with its redactions blacked out and submitted to the American people. In essence, the Commission could have produced a final product where the resulting conclusions and recommendations could be trusted. Instead, at the end of the day, what we got were some statements that truly insulted the intelligence of the American people, violated our loved ones' memories, and might end up hurting us one day soon. One such statement was that 9/11 was a failure of imagination. A failure of whose imagination? What exactly does that mean? When you have a CIA director with his hair on fire, a system blinking red, 52 FAA warnings, an August 6, 2001 PDB entitled "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the United States," leads on several 9/11 hijackers, including Al-Hazmi, Madore, and Marwan al-Shayhi, warnings from many foreign governments, a Phoenix memo warning of Islamic extremists taking flying lessons, the arrest of would-be terrorist Zacarias Moussaoui, facts imparted to one agent, Agent Frasca at the RFU of the FBI. 9/11 was truly a failure, all right, but I would certainly not call it a failure of imagination. Once again, these warnings and threats were not received in a vacuum, nor were they so common an occurrence that they should have been ignored in the wholesale and brazen manner in which they were. To me, it seems rather clear that there were enough warnings making their way to the appropriate people that meant that the proverbial dots should have and could have all been connected. And thus, in light of all the incoming information in 2001, exactly whose failure was it to understand that our new enemy was terrorism, and exactly who failed us by not having the agencies do anything in a defensive posture to protect Americans from just this possibility? Another outrageous statement made at the time of the release of the 9/11 final report that got a fair amount of media coverage was the one, "Everyone's to blame, therefore no one's to blame." The problem with that assumption is that it creates a no-fault government. And a no-fault government does nothing to ensure that things will be different or better in the future. When you hold people accountable, it serves as a deterrent for those that would repeat that same behavior in the future. For the record, I would like to see that assumption restated to read, "Everyone's to blame, therefore everyone's to blame." In fact, the fact that there has been no accountability for the failures that led to the deaths of almost 3,000 people is truly unconscionable and irresponsible on the part of all of our nation's leaders. So what do we do now? The tools of democracy available to the citizens of America to address these issues are incredibly limited. We asked for an independent commission to investigate 9/11 because that was the only tool that we, as American citizens, had access to, and hoped that our leaders, the members of Congress, and the American public would ensure its validity and that its ensuing recommendations would make us all safer, all as safe as we could reasonably expect to be in the event of another attack. We spent 14 months collecting information and lobbying for the creation of the Commission, and another 20-plus months monitoring the Commission's work, forwarding any and all research, making sure to send along our questions for the witnesses who were questioned, attending the hearings, making phone calls and lobbying for the extensions of time and money, sending thousands of emails, all in the hope that in the end, Americans could feel confident that we had indeed the definitive story of 9/11. Sadly, as Americans, we have all been let down. On the morning of 9/11, I lost my husband and best friend of almost 16 years. My two children, Matt and Sarah, lost their beloved father on that terrible day. And from that horrible day of September 11, 2000 forward, it has been made clear that in not allowing for truth and justice to prevail, America may have forever lost her way. For those who might question the reasoning and importance for re-examining the Commission's report, the events that led up to and the day of September 11th, one only has to recall the enormous ramifications that the attacks of September 11th have had on our country. Our leaders have, almost overnight, reformed government agencies and instituted innumerable laws in the interest of national security and are living in a post-9/11 era. Some, like the controversial Patriot Act, were forced through Congress without the benefit of congressional debate to determine its necessity and effectively find the proper balance between national security and our civil liberties. More lethally, our foreign policy has shifted to one of preemption, and thus we are at war in both Afghanistan and Iraq, where so many of our good men and women serving in the armed forces have lost their lives or have come home forever maimed. It is important to look back because in order for our leaders to make wise decisions about the changes we are instituting, we must understand what it was exactly that went wrong, that allowed our nation to become so vulnerable to terrorism, and we should not feel it improper to re-examine the investigations and decisions already made, especially in light of the fact that right after the 9/11 attacks, our leaders went full speed ahead with so many changes, most without the benefit of much of the information that has only recently been made available. Again, with lives on both sides of the equation, we cannot afford to be wrong or caught off guard either over there or here at home like we were on the morning of 9/11. Thus, only an honest reevaluation of how the 9/11 attacks could have happened will allow us to reverse the adverse consequences of overreaching laws and the existing loopholes in our security systems in order to allow us to be safer in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie, for that very compelling and well-researched testimony and for reminding us of why we are all here, outlining those very important yet unanswered questions. Laurie, do you have a copy of your document, your well-researched document for Congresswoman McKinney's staff?
Okay.
Okay, we'd like to have that. You're speaking on behalf of the other family members, are you not? We'd like to introduce our questioners at this time to see if they have questions of this panel. We're going to, our questioners, I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we will entertain one question from each questioner. We're Mike Rupert, who is from The Wilderness. Mike. Wayne Madsen is the independent investigative journalist. Wayne. And Ray McGovern, who is a former CIA agent. Ray. We're going to begin our questioning with Representative McKinney.
Thank you. And I have a ton of questions, but I think it's more important that I just make a statement, and that is how compelling and thoroughly researched your testimony has been today. How absolutely moving it was to hear your husband's voice so that we have the opportunity to touch and feel as best we can a little bit of what you feel, what you must feel. And those feelings then compel you to ask questions, to seek answers. And you deserve to have those answers. I just want to thank you so much, the three of you, Laurie, Mindy, and Monica, for being here with us today and enlightening us and sharing with us a little bit of your pain and of your patriotism to want the best out of your government, our government, and for the future of our country. Thank you very much.
We'll begin our questioning now. Mike Rupert. Can you
No.
press the button to
Press the
turn your
button.
mic on? Thank you.
Okay, this is difficult for many of us and somewhat cathartic even all this time after the attacks. And I think I speak for many people in this room to express my gratitude to you, because it's apparent that you have not stopped digging even after the release of the Kane Commission report, and your positions seem to have changed a great deal since then. One of my biggest questions would be, you mentioned them in passing, the war game exercises, which we now know were taking place. There were 5 simultaneous exercises, and I think we'll hear from another presenter today, 6, which in effect paralyzed NORAD response on the day of September the 11th. And you'd also gone to read the footnotes, and I want to comment that I saw Congressman Hamilton, who was the vice chair of the commission, on C-SPAN recently denigrating people who bothered to read the footnotes and point out the inconsistencies, but I thank you for doing that. There is one particular footnote that I will refer to very quickly in the Kane Commission report, which referred to the war game exercise Vigilant Guardian, and I think it's footnote 161, it's in my book, as an over-the-pole Russian exercise to practice for Russian bombers, when in fact the NORAD website indicates that the Russian over-the-pole exercise in progress that day was Northern Vigilance, not Vigilant Guardian, which we now know, thanks to USA Today and many other sources, and on the record sources submitted to the Commission, was a hijack drill. And we also have statements from Richard Clark in his book that there was another exercise in progress that day called Vigilant Warrior. And I have obtained an on-the-record statement from a NORAD officer indicating that that was a live fly exercise. Have you looked into the issue of the war game exercises, and how important a question do you feel that is to answer? Because I also, and I'll shut up with this, you have gone past the point of you have deliberately stopped using the word mistakes, that there were a bunch of mistakes that occurred on 9/11, that it was all somehow a bunch of sequential accidents, and you made a deliberate statement about the FBI. Are you beginning to feel that there was some deliberate action that might have affected NORAD's response that day?
We waited a long time before we came out with, criticism of the report, because it took a long time to read the report and the footnotes and wait for the monographs to come out. We didn't want to jump to any conclusions, so we gave everybody the benefit of the doubt for a very, very long time, which is why our language has shifted now that we see, more of what was and wasn't in there. As far as the war games go, we read Richard Clark's book also, and I think it's page 4 that talks about a different exercise that's not in the Commission report, and it's something that has disturbed us also, because if you're talking about the definitive report of 9/11, everything that happened on the morning of 9/11 should be included, and it isn't. So it's upsetting.
Thank you. Before we go to our next questioner, I'd like to ask if there are any speakers in the audience who have not had an opportunity to contact John Judge. Would you please raise your hand? Okay. And John is at the end of the table, if you could go over there and see him. Our next questioner, Wayne Matson.
Thank you. Laurie, I was particularly interested in what you said about the United Flight 93, the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, and the lack of any seismographic record of that impact. And I was wondering if you had the chance or opportunity to speak to any of the people in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where the plane actually crashed, because many of them talk about the 8-mile debris field, which is not indicative of an impact by putting the plane into the ground. Also, they mention another aircraft seen in the area that day, that morning. And the other thing I'll add is, although we hear an awful lot right now from disgruntled people in many of the intelligence agencies, one we don't hear an awful lot from is the National Security Agency. And I had the chance to talk to someone who was on duty that morning at the National Security Operations Center, the NSOC, which is sort of the nerve center for all communications intercepts in the U.S. intelligence community, and this individual heard in the tactical communications area over the loudspeaker that morning 2 U.S. Air Force pilots over Pennsylvania stating, we are engaging the target. And so this is the first indication out of NSA that there were U.S. military aircraft in the area, and that they obviously did what Mr. Rumsfeld, he kind of messed up, and he said when they shot down the plane in Pennsylvania, and then corrected himself. But I was wondering if you've heard any of this from the people in Shanksville or any other sources on the plane in Pennsylvania.
You know, we did not speak to anybody in Shanksville. Our bottom line was that we were hoping that that was the job of the commission, and that at the end of the day, when they released their report, there wouldn't be so many questions outstanding, either by us or other citizens, that you would have been able to read the report and felt that you had all those areas covered. And, you know, obviously it wasn't.
Okay. Thank you. Our last questioner, Ray McGovern, former CIA agent with VIPS, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity.
I would like to refer first to the remark made by Congresswoman McKinney referring to Colin Powell's very mysterious promise that we would have a white paper. He made that promise a week or so after 9/11, and then 10 days later he said, oops, I misspoke. You're not going to have a white paper on this. You're going to have to depend on the press to figure out what happened. That's precisely what he said. I was always mystified by that. I said to myself first, well, they must not have much information. Well, I think that Laurie Van Auken's testimony today, however brief it was, shows that there was a plethora of information. Indeed, the reason there's no white paper is because there was too much damning, too much incriminating information, too much. And I just would like to comment on the unusually smiling and greatly deferential attitude that the committee members and staff exhibit to you, the families, in public, and the way they have ignored your questions in private. And I'm just wondering how you feel, how you felt when you saw the final report come out, dismissing many of your questions, avoiding many of the others, and leaving, as you've already said, so many questions unanswered. What do you suppose lies behind that? Is it simply gross incompetence? Is it arrogance? Or is it something worse?
You know, I don't know. And what I could tell you is that, unfortunately, first, we've learned to lower our expectations every time we go through another process. So when the final report came out, while we were hopeful, you know, it was just another disappointment. But we feel that we have to remain undeterred from those disappointments and just keep plugging along. It's not for us to determine motive or why. We need to make sure that the mission of making the nation safe is completed, and we will just keep plodding along until we feel that that has been accomplished.
I admire you all for hanging in there. Thank you.
Thank you all. We want to thank the panelists, and invite our second panel to move to the table, please.
Can we show them our appreciation for being here this morning?
Moving quickly to our second panelist, we could ask John Judge, Mel Goodman, and David McMichaels to join us at the panelist table, please. quickly. Is David McMichaels here? If so, would you please join us at the panelist table? All right, our second panel, if we could ask everyone to resume your seats quickly so we can begin our second panel. This discussion will be behind the 9/11 Commission, flaws in the process, a staff report, a citizen's critique. We're going to begin with John Judge, staff and 9/11 Citizens Watch. John?
Thank you. We're running late, and I wanted to keep my comments short, but I think that it's in the best interest of everyone to take a second look at what we've been given as a final report of the National Commission on Terrorist Acts upon the United States. It's being seen as an authoritative report, often by people that haven't taken the time to read it. It was hailed as a bipartisan consensus in the making, and a final word. And I think all day today you're going to see that it rarely meets that standard. It was followed by 2 monographs, and then a year later, 1 more. Although each of the 9 investigative teams were working on a monograph, Representative Hamilton said that we will get no further monographs from those investigative teams. And it's interesting that the monographs that were released contained a page from Director Philip Zelikow of the Commission, basically exempting them from the conclusions of the monograph, saying that the quote is, while the commissioners have been briefed on the work and have had the opportunity to review earlier drafts of some of this work, they have not approved this text, and it does not necessarily reflect their views. This seems to indicate that while there might have been a bipartisan consensus by the commissioners in this report, seems to reflect there might not have been a consensus between the investigative staff and the rest of the people on the commission. It was a commission that was beset with problems from the beginning. Not only the obstruction in its creation, but underfunding that wasn't really effectively solved in a limited time period for political purposes. And even though they did a great deal of work, 2,000 interviews, collected documents, the report is essentially self-referential. The reason I say that is that almost 100 pages at the end of the report in tiny print have footnotes to interviews and documents and evidence, not a page of which, classified or unclassified, can be seen by the public. The National Security Archives recently did a Freedom of Information Act request for every single document listed in the footnotes from all the agencies involved, and every single request was denied. And denied in some cases on grounds that don't fit the legality. So basically you have a report where you're being asked to trust the investigators that what they saw in the evidence led them to their conclusions, and you don't need to verify it independently, but I don't think that's the way it should work in a democracy. They took some public testimony, but that testimony was marked by being primarily focused on the recommendations of the Commission and its policy, not on the events of 9/11. And the majority of that testimony on the events was taken at the end of the long discussion about policy. In other words, they were making the policy recommendations before they found out what happened on 9/11. And the actual author of the report is still unstated, but I think in recent articles in the New Republic by Ernst May, we get an inkling, and also the release of the book Blind Spot, part of which was commissioned to be written by the 9/11 Commission by Timothy Naftali, that Naftali is at least the intellectual author of the report, and its primary conclusion that this was an intelligence failure. And that's the focus of his book. Zelikow, the director, Ernst May, who also worked on the Commission staff at the top level, and Naftali, who was commissioned to do that work, all three are part of the University of Virginia Miller Center on Public Affairs, a rather interesting institution that bears some scrutiny, and they have a long history together of scholarship at Yale and Harvard that interlinks with studies of U.S. intelligence and including contracted work with U.S. intelligence concerning covert operations. And I think that that's one of the main problems that exist when you create a national security state, is how do you investigate it without involving the people that are already part of that national security state. And this report reflects that in the choice that they made of the people that would be brought onto the staff. And I'm sure we'll be addressing some of that later, but they say it openly in Ernst May's article that that was actually their priority, to get people that had been part of earlier covert operations. And yet at the same time, the report fails, as we'll see in testimony later today, to address the historical framework of the covert operations that seem to have led into 9/11. The missing white paper was mentioned, and it did show up in England. In the British press, they said that a white paper about the suspects and the evidence was given to them in order to get them to participate in the war in Afghanistan. And the quote in the British press was, "It's not enough to go to court, but it's enough to go to war." And so I'm not sure what the paper would show or what kind of evidence that is, but it isn't evidence that we ever got a chance to look at. This Commission's report is not a rush to judgment, it's rather a rush to exoneration. And it fails to really hold people accountability and to accountability. In doing that, it doesn't make a witch hunt out of an investigation, but having standards of accountability, at least calling witnesses that might be accountable people in the events, would lead to a rigorous investigation and maybe getting at the truth, because people might be more forthcoming. In the beginning, the Commission didn't even take testimony under oath. And Governor Keene, the director, told us that they thought people would be more forthcoming if they were not under oath. We found that a little counterintuitive. I think that in addition to its own flawed assumptions and how it approached it, it also faced ongoing obstruction by the White House that refused to release documents, even refused to release the classified version of the joint Senate and House intelligence inquiry study that had been prepared by some of the people that sat on the 9/11 Commission and who had sat in on the classified testimony of that commission. And they did that consistently in terms of who would be testifying publicly and whether it would be under oath or not. There was very little transparency and very little accountability. They were exempt under the law from the Freedom of Information Act in their work, and they were exempt from the Family Advisory Committee Act, so that there couldn't be any formal advisory committee by the family members that were here, and no family member was part of the board. And by approaching the whole matter as an intelligence failure in the report, it obscured the evidence that what was normally a standard operating procedure in the period prior to 9/11 fell apart, apparently, in the months around and on that day. And it led to them pursuing leads and suspects, basically accepting earlier reports without doing further follow-up, blaming certain suspects, even though the evidence is that we don't yet clearly know who the suspects were that got onto the plane. And that's because several people have come forward saying that their identity was stolen, basically, by these people. So if we track that identity back in time, it doesn't tell us whether it's the person using it, a second person using it, or the original person involved. And it's only that evidence, tracing those identities back in time, and primarily the testimony of 3 people that are still in protective custody that the Commission could not interview. I'm talking about Ramzi Youssef, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, bin al-Shib, who are suspects or masterminds in the plot, never been brought to court. No one can question them. The Commission was not even allowed to talk to their handlers or interrogators. All they could rely on were the printed statements taken from these people in custody. We don't know if the statements are accurate or real. We don't know if they were conditions of torture. We have no idea because there was no way to check it. And so we're left with a story that comes from people that we can't get to, and we're left with a story that perhaps is giving us the wrong direction in terms of how we're looking. But until we open up the report and until we can look at the actual evidence and compare it and begin to actually investigate further on many of the areas that the Commission ignored, then we have a report that doesn't eventually serve the mandate that this Commission was required to take care of looking at the truth of terrorist acts upon the United States. And it was acts, it was plural, and another terrorist act upon the United States the Commission completely ignored was the anthrax incidents that followed about a month later and that have never been adequately investigated or brought forward. That investigation seems to have stopped at a point where they got to the gate of Fort Detrick, and then there hasn't been anything since. And this is going on years now in the situation. So,
okay, John Judge. A member of Citizens Watch, we should say, an advocacy group that diligently monitor the government's actions, and currently a staff assistant with Representative McKinney's office. Mel Goodman is a professor of international security at the National War College and a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. From 1966 to 1986, he was a senior CIA Soviet analyst. And in 1991, he was one of 3 former CIA officials to testify before the Senate against the nomination of Robert Gates as Director of Central Intelligence on the ground that he had slanted intelligence to suit policy. Mel Goodman.
Thank you very much. 2 personal remarks first. One, I want to thank Congresswoman McKinney for what she is doing. This is an important examination of a 9/11 Commission that was an historic opportunity that was missed in a 9/11 Commission study that is terribly flawed. And I know that Congresswoman McKinney is perceived by many as to be contrarian. Well, I know how difficult it is to be a contrarian in the limited kinds of democracy we practice these days, and I hope one day her views will be considered conventional wisdom and not contrarian views. My other personal observation is I just left the government after 42 years of service, mainly with the CIA, but also the Department of Defense, the State Department, and the U.S. Army. That experience was important to me. I believe in public service, and I've always believed that institutions will prevail over the long run and truth will come out. And I think the 9/11 Commission has taught me that we need to be extremely rigorous and extremely tenacious in pursuing that truth because there's a corporate mentality in this country that's working against allowing the truth to surface, even in tragedies such as the 9/11 tragedy. This morning I'm going to talk about the flawed Commission itself, and this afternoon I'm going to be talking about the flaws of the Commission reforms, which for the most part are counterproductive and will ultimately do great harm to the intelligence community. But there is one piece of connecting tissue that I want to emphasize in my morning remarks and my afternoon remarks, and it's very simply this. The 9/11 tragedy, this terrible tragedy, was not due to oversight problems, it wasn't due to budgetary problems, it wasn't due to systemic or structural organizational problems, it wasn't due to organizational flaws. This is what the 9/11 Commission studied, and this is what they would have you believe. The 9/11 tragedy was due to personal failings. Institutions didn't make mistakes. People made mistakes. And the 9/11 Commission needed to observe the importance of accountability, and they didn't do this. And finally, and this is my real regret, The 9/11 tragedy was about bureaucratic cowardice at places such as the Pentagon and the Department of Defense, and this needed to be examined as well, and I hope eventually we can get into those areas. Now, let me say something about the Commission. I want to talk about the Commission itself, about the flawed process of the Commission, and finally about the conflict of interest within the Commission that is extremely important to understand the failure of the Commission. Remember, there have only been 3 historic opportunities when we've had a chance to look at the intelligence community in this country. One was after Pearl Harbor, and that led to a series of investigations that not only provided very trenchant analysis of what went wrong, but provided an outline for the National Security Act of 1947, which really was the most far-reaching, important national security reform we've ever had in this country, because what the National Security Act of 47 did was to set up the national security community as we understand it today. The second opportunity was after a period of important CIA domestic abuses, and that was the Church Committee and the Pike Committee. The Church Committee and the Pike Committee came up with excellent reforms that unfortunately were observed in the breach. And if we had followed the wisdom, particularly of Senator Frank Church, the late Frank Church, we may have prevented the terrible tragedies that have taken place in the last 5 years in terms not only of 9/11, but using false intelligence to send Americans into war where they did not belong in Iraq. The third opportunity, unfortunately, was the 9/11 tragedy, which gave us this important opportunity to at least try to get the intelligence community, which spends over $40 billion a year, try to get this institution correct and to understand it and to see what reforms need to take place. And of course, with the 9/11 Commission, this wasn't done at all. The 9/11 Commission had the broadest mandate of any commission in the history of the United States. With the exception of the Pearl Harbor Commission, there's probably been no more important national security commission. But in terms of broad mandate, the 9/11 Commission could have looked at any aspect of this tragedy, and it's regrettable that they didn't do that. Let me briefly look at the commission itself. What this country needed was an independent, nonpartisan commission. The commission wasn't nonpartisan. It was presented to us as bipartisan. Well, when you appoint a group of people, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, that is certainly not nonpartisan. And I would argue it isn't even bipartisan. What it is balanced partisanship. And you can look at the Commission's report time and time again to see where the Democrats on the Commission check the views of the Republicans, and the Republicans on the Commission check the views of the Democrats. So forget this notion that this was somehow a bipartisan commission. It wasn't. It was balanced partisanship, and it did a great deal of harm to the final product. Also, if you look at the makeup of the commission, here you have an insufficiency in the kinds of people who were picked to be on the commission. And I'm not going to look at the commission members one by one, but the fact of the matter is this is a group of people without any intelligence experience at all. This is not a group of people. Not one individual on this commission had ever received a president's daily briefing report, had never been involved as a consumer of intelligence, had very little understanding. And that was particularly true for one of the chairmen, the governor from New Jersey, who admitted he had no understanding of the intelligence community whatsoever. So there was insufficient stature, there was insufficient experience, there were insufficient knowledge of intelligence when this was totally relevant to what needed to be done. It would have been very easy to get a blue ribbon commission. You know, where were people such as Sam Nunn, William Perry, George Shultz, General Brent Scowcroft, Bill Bradley, David Boren, Gary Hart, even Warren Rudman, people who had served on the intelligence committees, who had studied the problem of intelligence and policy very closely and may have had a contribution to make on the importance of change within the intelligence community. Now let me look briefly at the process itself. The lack of stature may have contributed directly to the lack of rigor and the lack of tenacity within the Commission. The previous speaker spoke eloquently about the subpoena power that was unused, virtually unused, maybe totally unused. This was a commission that deferred at every step of the way to executive privilege. They had a mandate where they did not have to defer to executive privilege. Take the point of view about the President's daily briefs. The entire commission was not allowed to examine the President's daily brief. Only 4 commissions got a look at some of the President's daily briefs. So no commission member came away with an idea of what did the CIA actually inform the White House about the problems of terrorism in the spring and summer of 2001. The Commission also had the very good idea and correct idea that they should do their own debriefings of detainees. Now, we didn't know then, but we certainly know now how the CIA and the military used torture to gain testimony from these captives. But George Tenet told the co-chairman of the 9/11 Commission that they could not have permission to debrief the detainees on their own, and the commissioners just faded away. They didn't pursue this matter. They didn't go to the mat with George Tenet on this one. And also the matter of allowing the President and the Vice President to be debriefed together. This is obviously no way to run a commission. Now, in addition to the weakness in terms of rigor and tenacity, I think it's very important that the Commission did not avail itself of the products that were out there, some completed, some nearing completion, some in important stages of the drafting process, that would have been very useful to their own work. And the obvious document that they needed to have, that they made no attempt to take full use of, was the CIA Accountability Report. Now, not a lot is known about the CIA Accountability Report on 9/11, but this is the only report out there that actually gets into naming names, into dealing with those people who performed miserably in the period prior to 9/11. Remember, accountability is what is really one of the key issues that's at stake here. Find out who was involved, find out if these people were rewarded for their work instead of punished, and see what accountability issues can allow you to make systemic changes within the intelligence community. Now, the irony of all of this is that the CIA Accountability Report was requested by a joint Senate-House inquiry from 2002, which was signed by the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Porter Goss. Well, who is now sitting on the CIA Accountability Report that was completed exactly a year ago, actually in June 2004? None other than the Director of Central Intelligence, who is now Porter Goss. But in addition to not looking at the CIA Accountability Report, the Commission didn't take advantage of the excellent work being done by the Rob Silberman Commission on weapons of mass destruction to show that there were no weapons of mass destruction, even though you had one of the co-chairmen, Governor Kane, who believed the Bush administration rationale for why we had to go into Iraq because of the so-called links between Iraq and al-Qaeda and so-called large stocks of weapons of mass destruction. They didn't avail themselves of the important work done by particularly the Democrats in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the work done on the Office of Special Plans that was preparing false intelligence for the Bush administration that refuted, that could have been refuted in terms of the evidence that wasn't there for so-called links between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. And finally, a very important work that was done on intelligence reform was done by General Brent Scowcroft that was completed before the 9/11 Commission even began its work, and this work wasn't used. Finally, since I'm virtually out of time, let me just say one thing about conflict of interest. There were too many cases within the Commission by Commission members and staff members, particularly the staff director, Philip Zelikow, where people had to recuse themselves because of their own conflicts. I'm not in a position to get into all of the various conflicts, but the fact of the matter is this was known before these people were even appointed. And this should have been grounds, just as Henry Kissinger eventually had to resign as chairman of the 9/11 Commission because of his own conflicts of interest. They shouldn't have gone ahead to name those people who couldn't even take part in the serious work of trying to understand what happened on 9/11 and how do you reform the intelligence community. But the most important individual to me, other than a commissioner, was the staff director, Philip Zelikow. And his conflicts of interest were so great that you do have to wonder why this individual was appointed to head this important staff of over 80 people. He had very strong ties to the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, very strong personal and political and policy ties to Condoleezza Rice. But more importantly, Philip Zelikow was running the case study program at Harvard, which took millions of dollars from the Central Intelligence Agency over a 10-year period to write case studies on the CIA, to establish a record that was essentially untrue with the facts about the work of the CIA. And of course, the classic case study that Philip Zelikow chaired, along with Ernest May, who was his patron at the Harvard Kennedy School, was the case on the Soviet Union, how the CIA got it right, you know, the politics of getting it right. And of course, as we all know, one of the greatest disasters of politicization of intelligence that occurred even before the Iraq War was over the politicization of intelligence on the Soviet Union. And who did Philip Zelikow bring in to the staff structure as a team leader on his staff? None other than Douglas McCacken, who was serving a tour up at the Harvard Kennedy School. And who was Douglas McCacken? Douglas McCacken was the head of the Soviet analysis shop during the 1980s, who was responsible for most of the politicization of intelligence. So here you have Philip Zelikow from Harvard and the case study program, and Douglas McCacken as a team leader on Zelikow's staff, making serious decisions about the need for change within the intelligence community. My last word is, what this study is all about, and what this process is all about, is how do you regain integrity within the intelligence community, and how do you regain integrity with an investigative process such as the 9/11 Commission. And ultimately, that's not about changing structure, it's not about changing systems, it's not about changing organizations. It's about appointing people to important positions who have the nerve and the courage to tell truth to power. And that's what's missing from our government at this particular juncture.
Thank you, Mel Goodman. We're going to move now to our question and answer period. Again, we will ask for one question from, excuse me?
I was going to read what David McMichael said. I was going to read Sybil Edmonds' name.
No, we're going to do that.
Okay.
We got it under control, John. That's why I'm sitting on top.
We are going to entertain questions from our questioners, one question each, and we'd like for you to raise questions about the whistleblowers that have been ignored in the absence of David McMichael being a member of the panelists, and we would invite our panelists, John and Mel, to address that issue. So let's reverse the order and begin with Representative McKinney, and then we'll go to Ray McGovern.
Thank you very much. Again, I have a comment, and that is, it seems that I seem to have to say the same thing over and over and over again. And that is, Washington, D.C. seems to be the only place where you can make repeated mistakes at the job, on the job, at the workplace, and get a promotion. Now, I don't understand that. The average person goes to work, they wake up every day, and if they're late 5 days, they get docked their pay at least, or they may even get fired. So my question to the panelists is, what does the fact that we have seen promotions instead of punishment for failure, what, if anything, does that tell us about the policy that these people who were promoted were carrying out?
Well, let me make one observation about that. We all know about the famous remarks George Tenet made to the President. That will be his epitaph, that if the President wanted intelligence on Iraq that would help him go to war, that would be, quote, a slam dunk, unquote. The CIA could get him any kind of intelligence he wanted, which is exactly what the CIA then did. George Tenet, when he left the government 6 months later, received the Presidential Freedom Award. When we finally get our hands on the CIA Accountability Report, and I think one day we will, and we find out the individuals who made the major errors, the major blunders, including people such as George Tenet, we're going to find a list of people who have been rewarded by the system. There's no doubt in my mind about that. I don't know it for a fact, but I can bet on it because that's what happened during the 1980s. The people who had the worst track record on the intelligence on the Soviet Union were rewarded through the system because the system wanted to paint the Soviet Union as 10 feet tall to justify Reagan's defense budgets that were at record levels for peacetime in the 1980s. The lesson from all of this, and it's a very serious lesson, is this kind of behavior, this kind of activity creates cynicism in a society. And it creates cynicism particularly among our young people. And when you have done that, when you have created cynicism and you turn people off to the important work of government and public policy and public service, you've really discredited yourself and you've really harmed the nation. And this is what I worry about.
Okay. Ray McGovern, did you have a question for our panelists?
The comments by Laurie Van Aken on all the whistleblowers who were ignored, her litany of, she must have mentioned about 12 of them, I think just stands and speaks for itself. Sibel Edmonds, who was here just a minute ago, is sort of the arch example of that, testified for 2.5 hours. Not a word of her testimony appeared in the final 9/11 Commission report. I would like to turn again to the composition of the Commission and ask Mr. Goodman about the two chairmen. We've talked a little bit about Governor Kaine, but nothing's been said about Lee Hamilton. Now, Lee has been, like many of the other commissioners, sort of anointed for the last year, virtually, well, almost canonized, I'd say beatified, you know. They've all been treated with great deference, and yet we hear from Laurie's very concise wrap-up this morning how they missed the ball on so many things. Lee Hamilton, in my memory, has a rather checkered career on commissions like this and in responsibilities such as this. I'm thinking Iran-Contra, for example. And I think that to evaluate his, quote, impartiality, end quote, one has to see or to take a look at how he functioned during Iran-Contra. Would any of you have any recollection of that? Or?
Well, actually, I do, but here is where I beg to differ, and this is my personal disappointment with Lee Hamilton. Lee Hamilton did excellent work during the Iran-Contra investigations, and I remember when he made a series of statements. I was teaching at the National War College in the late 1980s, and I made them required reading for the 150 military officers who were at the National War College. And to me, pardon the expression, he was my great white hope on the 9/11 Commission, because you knew that Governor Kaine really had no background whatsoever to deal with this, and there were very political types like John Lehman. Slade Gordon really did not belong on that commission. He performed poorly as a member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in the 1990s, but Lee Hamilton understood these issues. So my real regret is, where was Lee Hamilton during all of this? My other problem with both the co-chairmen, Kaine and Hamilton, is both said publicly, not in the report itself, that there was enough evidence that was accumulated, enough intelligence accumulated before 9/11 to prevent 9/11. Mm-hmm. Nowhere does the committee reach that conclusion. And actually, to be fair to some of the staff reports, there were 17 or 18 of them, and I'm very critical of the media community for not analyzing those staff reports. They were all on the Internet. All you had to do was go to the 9/11 Commission website and analyze them. The staff commission, or the staff studies of the commission, came closer to raising serious issues of accountability and blame than the final report did. So the final report, ultimately, is a cover-up. I don't know how else to describe the final report. And here, my great regret is Lee Hamilton didn't exercise the kind of stature he has as a man of integrity.
Mm-hmm. I would just note that at a public meeting where the family members were demanding that Philip Zelikow step down as the director, Governor Keane responded to their concerns by saying that he was aware, and the Commission was aware, of the conflicts with Mr. Zelikow. In fact, he and one of the commissioners, Jamie Gorelick, had to testify to their own commission, and he said that Zelikow had recused himself at certain points in the investigation. And then he paused for a second and he said, as all of us will have to recuse ourselves at some point. So that's the commission that's looking into it, a commission that every member of which has some conflict serious enough to recuse themselves. And but that's the dilemma, is how do you get somebody far enough outside the system to look inside the system or be allowed to?
In fact, our one of the family members, Bob McIlvaine, whose son, Bobby McIlvaine, an assistant VP of media relations at Merrill Lynch, who died on September 11th at the World Trade Center, would like to make a comment on that. We're joined on the dais by Mr. McIlvaine.
Yeah, Ray, you took some of my talk away when you mentioned Hamilton. But, John, I think you remember after the joint congressional investigation, when the Blue Book came out, and David Paturti, I'm a member of September 11th Family for Peaceful Tomorrows, and we went to talk to Lee Hamilton. And I'll never forget this, and the Jersey girls were there, and David and I, and we were talking about the 28 didactic pages of the Blue Book, the first commission. And he said to us, he says, well, as much as I would like that information to come out to the public, because of national security, I just couldn't allow it. Now, I spend my whole life researching. That's all I do. I don't know if I'm going to be able to write a book or what, but going back to Iran-Contra, it was absolutely phenomenal. He practically made the exact same comment on the commission of the Iran-Contra, when to me, there's a lot of people that should have been put in jail from that. It's the highest level. Yet he came out with that same statement, because of national security, we can't release certain information. And that bothers me. Now, that really angers me, but it's just, I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Bob. Our next questioner, Wayne Madsen.
Well, I'd like to keep this theme going because this was my question before your comments. It was on what we now know Mark Felt told Woodward, when you follow the money, you'll get at the root of all these scandalous operations. My question is, do you have a sense that when Bush first nominated Henry Kissinger to be the chairman, and then he stepped down because of conflicts of interest, and then they put Lee Hamilton on to take the place of George Mitchell, who also had conflicts of interest, that there was a conscious decision not to have this commission look into the money going back to the funding of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan? We could roll in BCCI, we could roll in Iran-Contra, and the fact that a wonderful former member of the House, chairman of the House Banking Committee, Henry Gonzalez, the late Henry Gonzalez, always expressed frustration that he got no cooperation from Lee Hamilton, the head of the House Intelligence Committee at the time, or I should add also from the person on the Senate Banking Committee that was looking into these issues, Senator John Kerry. He said he wasn't getting much help from. But so my question is, we heard about the mysterious stock puts that when I went to one of the news conferences, Hamilton said, I reject the premise of your question, even though Governor Kane said it was still on the table to investigate that. I don't think it ever was. These were the stock puts on United Airlines, other stocks before 9/11. The fact that Paul O'Neill, the Treasury Secretary, had gone to the United Arab Emirates and been briefed on suspicious money movements through the UAE Central Bank in Dubai. He was, to my knowledge, they didn't talk to him. Riggs Bank's involvement in the Bosnia Defense Fund, we know money bled into Al-Qaeda units operating in the Balkans. Then, so with all this information, was this just a stacked deck against looking at what Mark Felt said to Woodward, follow the money, that they would not follow the money?
Well, let John, I think, talk about the money issue. Let me just say one thing about the commission. The President didn't want the commission. The Senate Select Committee for Intelligence didn't want the commission. The House Committee on Intelligence did not want the commission. The first commissioner name was Henry Kissinger. Now, I have great respect in some ways for Henry Kissinger, but any of those who have read his memoirs know that this is not a person who looks for the truth from documentation. This is a person who uses documents to put the best face on an issue and really to sing the praises of Henry Kissinger. And I wrote an op-ed immediately after this appointment was made that this sort of gives away the game. There's no way they're going to get to the bottom of the 9/11 Commission because they're going to appoint the kind of commission that just won't go there. So if you look at the people who were selected and the way they were balanced off, 5 Democrats against 5 Republicans, an inexperienced governor from New Jersey, and a former congressman from Indiana who apparently was not up to it or did not want to apply the rigor that was needed, and look at the commissioners themselves, I think they got the product they wanted, which is to stay away from personal involvement, accountability, bureaucratic cowardice, and particularly what the White House knew and when it knew it and how much information did it have. You know, one thing that comes out of the staff reports that doesn't come out of the commission report, if you compare the work the Clinton administration did before the Millennium Crisis and the spike in intelligence material and how active the administration was to gather together the intelligence community and to pursue every lead and to stay on top of this situation, then look at the next spike in intelligence reporting on terrorism, which was the spring of 2001, when nothing was done. Important positions went unfilled, particularly at the Pentagon. Rumsfeld didn't want to talk about terrorism because he wanted to deploy a national missile defense system in Alaska and California that doesn't work. And you had a national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, who wasn't keeping the president up to date and wasn't checking on how the bureaucracy was performing on this very important matter of terrorism, as Richard Clarke was trying to communicate to her. So they got the report they wanted by appointing the commission that they felt they needed to appoint, which is classic for if you look at commissions in the history of Washington politics, that's how you, as you say, stack the deck.
I'll just say in the interest of time, you'll hear about the money in the other panels in great detail.
Okay. While we are in this segment on whistleblowers, we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge the presence of Sibel Edmonds, who has joined us here. If you could just... Sibel, many of you may know, is a former FBI translator who gained prominence when she went public with information that suggests that the U.S. was warned of the impending attacks using airplanes as missiles to attack buildings within the U.S. Thank you, Sibel. Our next questioner, go right to Mike Rupert.
Professor Goodman, you and I will forever and strenuously disagree about a couple of things, one of which is your statement that these were blunders and they were personal and not institutional. I will go to my grave, and I believe my book documents an irrefutable case that the mistakes, quote unquote, made were deliberate, intentional, and they were both personal and systemic. You made a brief reference to Pearl Harbor, and there's a book by, and I've butchered a couple of first names. I got the last names right today, but Stinnett, I believe his first name is Richard, Day of Deceit, with FOIA release of documents showing that we had broken the Japanese codes prior to Pearl Harbor, knew the attacks were going to take place, and allowed them to happen. I go further with respect to 9/11, arguing that we facilitated the attacks. We'll never agree on that, and I stipulate
never will agree on that.
Wanted to say that. Perhaps we can agree on something. You talked about the deliberate slanting of intelligence, and I'm well familiar with DCI Gates, who was a DDI, I believe, under Bill Casey, Deputy Director of Intelligence. But from Richard Helms all the way through George Tenet, there have been allegations and records indicating that intelligence has been slanted for political purposes. I think we can agree on that. Looking at the 9/11 Commission, the Kane Commission, with these abundant conflicts of interest, I'm particularly taken aback within the last week seeing now this startling new evidence that Iran had something to do with 9/11 after seeing 20 to 40,000 Iraqi civilians killed in a what I think is a useless invasion of Iraq, too many deaths of American service personnel. How, in your opinion, was the spin placed or the intelligence placed as a result of these conflicts of interest in the Kane Commission to produce a political result, and what political results have come as a result of the Kane Commission that were purely political?
Well, this afternoon I'm going to be talking about the reforms that stem directly from, I think, the ineptitude of the Commission, because these are reforms that will not help the intelligence process. Let me say one thing about the intelligence reforms. If you look at the reforms of the 9/11 Commission, would any of those reforms prevented the misuse of intelligence and the politicization of intelligence that were used to lead this country into war? Not one of them. If you look at the reforms, would one of those reforms prevent another act of terrorism? No, of course not. So this is what I worry about, and I share your concern there. My problem is I find that most charges of conspiracy from my 42 years of federal service are really dealing with problems that are what the British call cock-ups and not conspiracy. And I think serious mistakes were made. I don't think they were willful in the case of 9/11 any more than they were in the case of Pearl Harbor. But this is no time to be debating that.
Thank you very much. We want to go and thank our panelists as we move to our next panel discussion, which is Omissions and Errors in the Commission's final report. We'd like to invite Paul Thompson, John Judge, Nafez Ahmed to the table.
Panelist John Judge has submitted for the record a list of national security experts who were censored by the 911 Commission, and this will be available for the record, on the record.
While we're waiting for our next panelists to take their seat, I'd just like to announce that today's briefing has been co-sponsored by Representative Raul Grijalva of Arizona, and we thank him for his participation as well. Also, if we made an announcement earlier, and I guess this is the part where I have to have egg on my face, because we announced that there was going to be lunch for everyone. Unfortunately, there's just lunch for the family members and the panelists. So if you were hanging on for more than just food for thought, I hate to be the one to have to break it to you. But food is available downstairs as well. We'll begin our next panel discussion. Our next panelists are, one moment please, Paul Thompson, who is the author of Terra Timeline. Just one second. Paul is a freelance researcher and is the creator of the Center for Cooperative Research's Complete 9/11 Timeline, a compilation of over 5,000 articles and reports on 9/11. In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, Thompson found himself poring over news of the attacks on the internet and growing increasingly frustrated with how incomplete the story of September 11th was. He began gathering and condensing every credible fact on 9/11 and posted these facts online in chronological order to build a Terra timeline. Paul?
Thanks. I want to start off on my discussion about the FAA and NORAD response on the day of 9/11 with a quote from Senator Mark Dayton. Last year he read the 9/11 Commission report and he was quite outraged. And let me tell you what he has to say. He said that NORAD and the FAA have covered up, quote, catastrophic failures, unquote, that left the nation vulnerable during the 9/11 hijackings. Quote, for almost 3 years now, NORAD officials and FAA officials have been able to hide their critical failures that left this country defenseless during 2 of our worst hours in history. NORAD officials lied to the American people, they lied to Congress, and they lied to your 9/11 Commission to create a false impression of competence, communication, and protection of the American people. He calls NORAD and FAA failures, quote, the most gross incompetence and dereliction of responsibility and negligence that I've ever, under those extreme circumstances, witnessed in the public sector. Now, what exactly is he talking about? What are these failures that were so grave? let me just start real briefly in mentioning what was happening before 9/11, what standard procedure was. NORAD, if you don't know, that's the military organization that defends the skies over the U.S. And the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, they had established standard procedures for air traffic controllers to contact NORAD whenever civilian planes strayed from their pre-arranged flight course or when they lost contact with air traffic control. When NORAD was contacted, they would typically send a fighter up to intercept whatever the problem was with the plane and figure out what was wrong. And then there would be a graduated response. First they might tip their wings, they might look into the cockpit and try to figure out what the problem was. Now NORAD claims that at the time of 9/11, the fighters on alert had up to 15 minutes to get airborne. And in fact, it just so happened that there were military exercises that were taking place that day, and they say that because of that exercise, the response time was more like 5 minutes. So within 5 minutes, they could have gotten the planes up into the air. Now this was, contrary to what some people say, this was actually an extremely common and standard procedure before 9/11. And it did not require White House approval. People would just make the decision on the spot in NORAD. For instance, in the year 2000, there were 425 unknowns. Pilots who didn't file flight plans, or they diverted from the flight plans, or they were using the wrong radio frequency or something of that manner. In many cases, the issues would get quickly resolved, but in that year, fighters had to take off and investigate these unknowns 129 times in the course of the year. So we see that this, what was supposed to happen on 9/11, which was that the fighters would get up very quickly, actually happened on a very regular basis, a couple times a week before 9/11. But what's strange, and what Mark Dayton is making reference to, is that there are all these conflicting accounts about what happened and how quickly the fighters responded. And I actually count 5 major accounts of what happened that day that are in serious conflict with each other. Originally, in the days after 9/11, right after 9/11, Richard Myers, the acting Joint Chief of Staff Chairman, a NORAD spokesman, New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, they all said that there were no fighters launched on the morning of 9/11 until after the Pentagon was hit at 9:37. But then just days later, on September 18th, 2001, NORAD put forth a timeline. They released a timeline that was significantly different. They said that fighters had been ordered to launch 45 minutes earlier than their first account. And then in May 2003, NORAD officials, prominent officials, testified under oath before the 9/11 Commission, and they put forth yet a different timeline that had many different numbers about what happened and when it happened. And then in January 2004, there was a book put out by the military called Air War Over America that had, yet again, very different account of what happened and when it happened. And finally, the 5th timeline that we come to, the 5th account, is put forth by the 9/11 Commission in June and July of 2004. And this one is probably the most conflicted of all. It's almost a complete rewrite of what happens with the hijacked planes and the response from the fighters. So there's just all this confusion. And you know, I have very limited time here to talk about this. This is a very complicated issue. So what I decided to do was, rather than go in depth about or try to cover all 4 flights, I'm just going to focus on one of the flights, and we can use that as a case study to really see what was indicative of all the flights. So I decided to focus on Flight 77. And let me just give you some brief information about what happened there. So Flight 77, a problem began on that flight at 8:56 when the transponder signal was turned off. So there was no longer a a radar signal, except for the primary kind of backup radar signal. And at the same time, radio communication with the air traffic control stopped. So by this time, one of the planes has already crashed into the World Trade Center. Some of the other planes are missing. So certainly this would be evidence that a plane has been hijacked, at least to strongly suspect that. However, the 9/11 Commission says that the air traffic control, which was the Indiana-based Indianapolis Air Traffic Control Center, when they got this information, they no longer have the transponder signal, they no longer have contact, that they don't tell anybody about this. This is what the 9/11 Commission says. But there's a lot of problems with this. For instance, from other accounts, we know that within minutes of the plane disappearing, American Airlines headquarters was notified, according to newspaper reports, and even the testimony of some people from American Airlines. And then according to the New York Times, the National Military Command Center, the NMCC, located in the Pentagon, was also notified, just within minutes. This is what you would expect, that notification would be going out. But in fact, what the 9/11 Commission says is they say, for some reason, the Indianapolis Flight Control Center assumed that Flight 77 had accidentally crashed into the ground. They're not even thinking about a hijacking. And so, in response to thinking about an accident, they contacted the West Virginia State Police and asked if there were reports of a downed aircraft. They contacted Air Force Search and Rescue Unit, asked them to look for downed aircraft, and they contacted the local FAA office. And that's all they contacted. They didn't contact NORAD to, we talk about the standard procedure of 129 times happening when you lose contact with the plane, just as a matter of course, you send a fighter up to see what happened. For some strange reason, the 9/11 Commission is saying that that didn't happen. In fact, 9/11 Commission claims that not only they didn't contact NORAD, they didn't contact FAA headquarters, they didn't contact FAA Command Center, which was responsible for the day-to-day operations of the whole air traffic system. They didn't even contact the neighboring flight control centers to see if any of them had spotted the missing plane. So then at 9:05, the plane reappeared in the airspace managed by Indianapolis, allowing them to realize the plane had turned around and was headed east towards Washington, D.C. And we even have the American Airlines headquarters claiming in testimony to the 9/11 Commission that they had been told the plane was turned around. But the 9/11 Commission says this isn't so. And then I find this quite incredible. 9/11 Commission claims it wasn't until 9:20 when Indianapolis communicated with the FAA Command Center and notified them that Flight 77 was missing. And then the information started to get out to other command centers, but still NORAD wasn't notified. Nobody told, we're talking over half an hour later, the plane has been missing, still no one notifies NORAD, until finally 9:34, 3 minutes before the plane crashes, and then it was only mentioned inadvertently in passing when talked about something else. So in order for this to be true, the 9/11 Commission is making the claim essentially that the Indianapolis Flight Control Center and the local FAA center that they contacted were in complete lack of contact with the outside world during this time, that they were unaware, unlike the tens of millions of people who'd been watching CNN, that there was an ongoing crisis, that planes had crashed into the World Trade Center, 2 planes. They're saying that all the way until 9:20, there's been over half an hour now, this has been the breaking news, that nobody in this entire Indianapolis Flight Control Center or the FAA Center had any idea that any of this had been happening. And we know that just isn't true. In fact, there was one news report saying that other centers such as theirs had been notified of the crisis long before the first plane even crashed into the World Trade Center. so what we see is an account coming from the 9/11 Commission that, in my opinion, is just frankly impossible.
1 minute.
And I could go into a lot of length, unfortunately I'm out of time, about the fighter response, but we see all kinds of similar anomalies that really don't stand up when you look at them logically. According to what the 9/11 Commission says, there was no plane that actually came, no fighter that actually came to Washington to defend Washington for this plane or any other plane until about 10 o'clock, which is really remarkable. I mean, this plane was missing at 8:56, and nothing was done to defend Washington. No plane arrived for over an hour.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Our next speaker, Nafiz Mossadegh Ahmed, is Executive Director of the Institute for Policy Research and Development in London, England. He is the author of the recently published book, The War on Truth, 9/11, Disinformation, and the Anatomy of Terrorism, which deconstructs the findings of the 9/11 Commission report and investigates the worldwide web of terrorist networks across space and time. Good morning, Mr. Ahmed.
Thank you. The title of my section is Suspects and Plots, Osama bin Laden and U.S. Intelligence. So I'm going to try and present a number of important facts and reports that fundamentally challenge the official account of the nature and identities of the alleged 9/11 hijackers. Very briefly, though I won't be able to cover everything at all, but their relationship to Al-Qaeda and their activities as Islamic extremists. While I won't offer a kind of alternative theoretical explanation, it must be noted that the facts I'm going to refer to constitute as yet unresolved anomalies that strike at the core of the official narrative espoused by the 9/11 Commission and other previous inquiries. A variety of reports from reliable accounts, journalistic investigations, eyewitness testimonials provide a very bizarre picture at odds with the conventional portrayal of the 9/11 hijackers as Islamic fundamentalists. Two key hijackers, for example, Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shehi, are known to have visited the Woodland Park Resort Hotel in the Philippines several times between 1998 and 2000. Numerous local residents and hotel workers, according to the International Herald Tribune, recognized them from news photographs after the event. They reportedly, the report says, they drank whiskey with Philippine bar girls, they dined at a restaurant that specialized in Middle East cuisine, and visited at least one of the local flight schools. Al-Shehi himself threw several parties with different Arab friends. They drank alcohol, they had lots of big vehicles, they had a lot of money. And there are a number of reports like this. They spent time with the girls, the chambermaids, and so on and so forth. General kind of activity is not commensurate with this kind of strict Puritan Islamic ideology of Al-Qaeda. And there were many reports of this nature that I'm going to briefly give you. US investigators have said that 5 of the hijackers, including Atta al-Shehi, there are others, Nawaf Al-Hazmi, Ziad Jarrah, and Hani Hanjour, they visited Las Vegas 6 times between May and August 2001. According to the San Francisco Chronicle, for example, they, quote, engaged in some decidedly un-Islamic sampling of prohibited pleasures in America's reputed capital of moral corrosion, unquote. The activities included drinking alcohol, which is strictly prohibited in Islam, gambling, the same, and visiting strip clubs. And I could go on. I don't want to repeat the kind of reports that are available, but suffice to say that the number and consistency of the reports is sufficient to conclude that this is true. These guys were basically not acting at all in accordance with the kind of traditional requirements of Islam. Just to give you an idea, I have a quote from an expert. His name is Mahmoud Mustafa Ayub. He's a professor of religion at Temple University in Philadelphia, and he specializes in Islamic and Middle East studies. He said, it's incomprehensible that a person could drink and go to a strip bar one night, then kill themselves the next day in the name of Islam. People who would kill themselves for their faith would come from very strict Islamic ideology. Something doesn't add up here. Just to give you a kind of deeper understanding of what we're talking about, I mean, Al-Qaeda is basically a radical tendency within a broader Islamic movement known as the Salafi movement, which originates today in Saudi Arabia. It's derived from the Arabic term salaf, which means to precede, and refers to the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. And the general idea is that you have to very strictly follow the precise behavior of the Prophet. If you go outside of that boundary, you're basically exiled from the religion. You cannot call yourself a real Muslim. So the fact that these people were behaving in this way is very, very bizarre. And that's one element of the picture that I want to give you. What was their connection to Al-Qaeda? How were they connected to Al-Qaeda if they were behaving in a way which was supposedly completely at odds with Al-Qaeda traditions? Moving on from there, another very interesting phenomenon which needs to be acknowledged, and which the Commission report simply doesn't look at in any detail at all, is how these Al-Qaeda operatives were able to go in and out of the United States without any kind of sanction at all from the immigration services. There was a very interesting report by Joel Mowbray from the Conservative National Review. And what he argued, and he interviewed a number of State Department officials who worked in the he worked with visas and in consular affairs. And what he concluded was that expert analysis of these visas, the visa application forms of 15 of the 9/11 terrorists, showed that all of them among the 15 reviewed should have been denied visas under then existing law. It wasn't that the law was a problem and that we need to tighten the borders. It was that the law simply wasn't applied. 6 separate experts were interviewed by Mowbray. They analyzed the simple 2-page form and they came to the same conclusion. All of the visa applications they reviewed should have been denied on their face. And he catalogues some of the glaring problems with the visas, and he says even an untrained eye would be able to look at this and say this is impossible to allow these people into the country. And the very odd thing that I'd like to draw to your attention is I have a statement from a guy by the name of Michael Springman, who was chief of the U.S. consulate in Jeddah, and it's been confirmed that 15 of the hijackers, I believe, or perhaps the number is 13, I can't quite remember, but at least 13 of them obtained visas to the United States from the U.S. consulate in Jeddah. Now it's interesting because according to Michael Springman, who used to be head of the Visa Bureau in Jeddah in the 1980s, he said that he had been protesting to the State Department that the CIA, according to him, was using the U.S. consulate in Jeddah to grant visas to unqualified applicants from all over the world, basically to recruit mujahideen in the Afghan war. And what Mark Springman subsequently said in the aftermath of 9/11, that he's worried, after hearing these reports, that this pipeline wasn't closed up. And this is what he said. He said this in an interview with, I believe it's CBC Radio in Canada. I had not been protesting fraud. What I was protesting was in reality an effort to bring recruits rounded up by Osama bin Laden to the United States for terrorist training by the CIA. The State Department did not run the consulate in Jeddah. The CIA did. Of the roughly 20 Washington Dispatch staff there, I know for a certainty that only 3 people, including myself, had no ties to any of the U.S. intelligence services. So that is an issue that the 9/11 Commission has simply just not dealt with in sufficient detail. The other issue I want to bring up is the issue of military training. There are many reports that came out after 9/11 that many of the hijackers received U.S. military training at installations in the United States, which required a certain degree of security clearance. The reports came from Newsweek, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. 5 of the alleged hijackers, for example, it's been alleged, received training in the 1990s at secure U.S. military installations. These included, according to Night Reader News Service, Mohammed Atta had trained at the International Officer School at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. Abdulaziz Al-Omari had attended Aerospace Medical School at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas. Saeed Al-Ghamdi had been to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. And there are others. Apparently, 4 of them trained at the Pensacola Naval Air Station. And there are many other reports of this nature. Now, when this actually came out in the press, obviously there was a big kind of hullabaloo. How did this happen? And Senator Bill Nelson actually faxed the Office of the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, and he demanded to know, is this true? And September 17th was when he made contact, and he asked the Pentagon, can you confirm or refute these reports? Now, by September the 21st, Senator Nelson was informed that the FBI could neither say yes or no, according to his press office. Apparently, the Bureau was still investigating any connection to the military facility. Now, a pioneering journalist by the name of Daniel Hopsicker, he's a former producer at PBS Wall Street Week and former investigative reporter for NBC News, he contacted Senator Nelson's office a month later, and he wanted to know excuse me, precisely what was going on. And they said that the FBI had said that they are trying to get through something complicated and difficult. And this was several months after this happened. Now, Hopsicker wasn't satisfied with this, and in the end, he spoke to somebody at the Department of Defense and really pushed them. And in the end, the spokesman admitted, I do not have the authority to tell you who attended which schools. It's a very significant statement because it confirmed that somebody did attend schools, but we just don't have the authority to tell you. And again, this is an issue that the 9/11 Commission simply has not looked into. To give you one more thing, I mean, the other issue I wanted to discuss, but I won't be able to discuss in any detail here, is the extent of the surveillance of almost every one of the hijackers by the intelligence community. I mean, the evidence on the public record, I discussed this in my book, The War on Truth, it shows that every single hijacker was, for at least a year to more than a year, under the surveillance of the US intelligence community and often many other intelligence agencies. And despite that, despite some of them being known to the intelligence community, they were still able to come into the United States. I'll only give the example of Mohammed Atta. We have confirmation that Mohammed Atta was on a terrorist watch list since 1986. He had been implicated in a bus bombing in Israel. And now this is very strange. If he was on a terrorist watch list since 1986, it should have been, I mean, he was able to come in and out of the United States. I mean, his visa in particular had expired. Before he came in January 2001 for re-entry. He was in violation of his visa status. Somehow he was allowed in. And why wasn't the screens flashing that this guy is a confirmed suspected terrorist? And I guess I will close. I don't want to go into the details and take too much time. I will close just to give you an example. Is the conventional narrative tells us that Mohammed Atta was not extensively surveyed once he had entered into the United States. I found an interesting report from the Miami Herald quoting officials from the National Security Agency confirming that essentially conversations between Mohammed Atta, who was obviously the chief 9/11 hijacker, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was, he's been described as the kind of 9/11 mastermind. Their conversations between them occurred, and these were monitored by the National Security Agency while Mohammed Atta was in the United States. And the most interesting is here is that, I mean, the Herald points out that the NSA is prohibited by law from monitoring calls to and from the United States without special court orders. So this was approved. And yet this is something that has been denied, it hasn't been looked into. And the worrying thing, I have a report from the London Independent, officials say that Mr. Mohammed, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was in Pakistan at the time, received a telephone call from Mohammed Atta, the hijackers' ringleader, on 10th September. Intelligence officials who monitored and then translated that conversation believed that using coded language, Mr. Mohammed gave Mr. Atta the final approval to launch the strikes. And the question, of course, needs to be asked is that what else remains of these conversations that were intercepted, how much information was available, and why was this not acted on and circulated in the intelligence community appropriately, and why hasn't the Commission, first and foremost, dealt with this issue? In conclusion, I will summarize this kind of brief presentation.
Extremely briefly, like
very
in
briefly.
2
9/11 hijackers,
seconds.
they were clearly not Islamic extremists. It's difficult to see how this fact fits with the conventional assumption that they were devout members of Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. Furthermore, and alternatively, it's difficult to see how, even if they were members of Al-Qaeda, how the conventional depiction of Al-Qaeda as a network of devout militant Islamic extremists can be maintained, given this distinctively un-Islamic conduct. The question then arises, as to who these people were, and alternatively, what was the nature of this apparent Al-Qaeda cell. The official narrative as it stands cannot resolve this problem. It's exacerbated in light of the fact that the majority of the 9/11 hijackers repeatedly entered and re-entered the United States on fraudulent visas, apparently supplied by the U.S. consulate in Jeddah, which reportedly has a CIA connection. Worse still, many of these hijackers, while in the United States, somehow managed to obtain high-level security clearance to train at several U.S. military installations. They had simultaneous connections with the U.S. military while they were connected to Al-Qaeda, and I will leave it at that. This is a fundamental anomaly. It strikes at the core of the official narrative. I don't know what the explanation is. I won't pretend to, but we need to have some kind of investigation to resolve this.
We're lenient with Mr. Ahmed because he has come such a long, long way. But I do want to just mention to you these 2 books. The War on Truth by Nafiz Ahmed and The Terror Timeline by Paul Thompson. I highly recommend these 2 books to all of the people who are listening in our audience. Now, from time to time, you will hear bells ringing and buzzers going off and me popping up and darting out. It's because we have votes going on in the Capitol, and I have a limited amount of time in order to get over there. So I will be going in and out, as I'm about to do now, because they've just called a vote. But this will go on, and we will get back on schedule.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Representative McKinney. As Representative McKinney said, we will get back on schedule after lunch, but in the interest of time, we're going to combine the next 2 panels. So I'd like to, at this point, invite John Newman and Marilyn Rosenthal to join us at the panelist table. And John Judge, who is a veritable wealth of information, we're going to invite him to integrate his comments into the question and answer period. So if you all panelists can stay put, and we'll invite the other 2 panelists to join you. We'd like to get an initial statement from each of you, and then we'll go to the question and answer period for all of our panelists. So we can begin with John Newman. John Newman, bear with me, spent 21 years in Army intelligence and served as assistant to the director of the National Security Agency. He also served as an attaché in China. He is a history professor at the University of Maryland and has been teaching courses in counterterrorism for 10 years. Newman has written and published widely and is working on a manuscript about the events leading up to 9/11. John?
Okay, you can now? All right. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here today and to make my small contribution. It falls to me this morning to bring to your attention the story of Saeed Sheikh, whose full name is Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh, and his astonishing rise to power in Al-Qaeda and his crucial role in 9/11 was completely, utterly missing from the 9/11 Commission report. And also to deal with what U.S. intelligence knew about his links to the ISI, Pakistani intelligence, and what, if anything, was said or not said in the Commission report about these things. This 20-year, I'd also like to acknowledge Paul Thompson's timeline, without which I wouldn't have been able to do very much, at least get started. So let me just put that out there on the table. This 28-year-old British national of Pakistani extraction left his prestigious London School of Economics in 1993 to hook up with Pakistani terrorists in Bosnia. After that, he took up jihad and trained in the terror camps in Afghanistan. In 1994, he tried to spring a terrorist leader from a jail in India by luring an American and 3 Britons to locations where they were kidnapped, but the plot failed, and he ended up in jail instead. The hostages were rescued. Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, paid for his lawyer, but he was never tried during his 5 years of incarceration. In 1995, 5 hostages, including an American, were killed in an attempt to spring Syed Sheikh from jail. An Indian citizen was murdered in 1999 when Al-Qaeda and the ISI succeeded in freeing Syed Sheikh by hijacking Indian Airlines Flight 814. Bin Laden immediately appointed Syed Sheikh as a member of the Majlis al-Shura, the elite political council of Al-Qaeda, and referred to Sheikh as his special son. No attempt was made to arrest him when he returned to Pakistan. The ISI gave him a home and protection from the police. He lived openly and frequented swanky parties attended by senior government officials. U.S. government sources told Newsweek he was a protected asset of the ISI. During his imprisonment, there was no indictment and no trial in India. There were no indictments in Britain or the United States either. Despite his kidnapping of British citizens, he was allowed to immediately travel to London. Go figure. On January 2, 2000, the British Foreign Office spokesman only say that this was so because he was a British citizen and had not been convicted of any offenses overseas. There was no conviction because there had been no trial. And Britain could have indicted and tried Syed Sheikh if they'd wanted to. The fact is they didn't want to. They waited until after a September 2002 conviction for the murder of Daniel Pearl, for whom most Americans know about this man, to ask questions of the Indian government about him in connection with the first kidnapping. The British press called this long delay a mystery, but the outraged families of Sheikh's victims condemned it and called their government's decision a disgrace and a signal to others to do the same. The Americans did not act either. Even though he had kidnapped an American citizen in '94 and another American had died in the attempt to break him out in '95. These events led to no indictment in 1994, no indictment in '95, and there was no indictment after the hijacking of Flight 814 in 1999. The United States would wait until after the 9/11 attacks to take action, sealing an indictment of Syed Sheikh for the 1994 kidnapping in November 2001. The question is why? Did the United States not indict Syed Sheikh because he was a British informant? While the CIA itself claims that it failed to penetrate al-Qaeda's leadership, the agency has acknowledged on Capitol Hill and various forums that there were numerous sources being handled by foreign intelligence services. Did the agency receive information provided by Syed Sheikh from British or Pakistani intelligence? This would help explain why Syed Sheikh was not indicted and escaped justice for his crimes and traveled freely around England. If this is correct, then if Syed Sheikh had been arrested, the best penetration of the al-Qaeda leadership would have been lost. Al-Qaeda had learned in the early 1990s from the Ali Mohammed case, many of you probably know about, I can't take the time to go into, that the benefits far outweighed the risks of becoming an informant for a Western intelligence agency. And I was interested in your presentation there and where you were going with the whole visa thing in Jeddah for that same reason. If the foregoing analysis has any merit, Western intelligence agencies were receiving reports from a senior al-Qaeda source. Once again, however, al-Qaeda had used Western intelligence to accomplish its own mission. Syed Sheikh was probably a triple agent. According to Pakistani police reports, for 2 years after his release, Syed Sheikh traveled regularly to training camps in Afghanistan where he trained recruits for al-Qaeda. According to British police reports, he trained the 9/11 terrorists in hijacking techniques. Syed Sheikh turned al-Qaeda, oh, by the way, he reported directly to Abu Zubaydah, al-Qaeda's chief of external operations. He turned al-Qaeda into the more capable and operationally secure organization that it was on the morning of 9/11. Syed Sheikh, the man about whom the Commission report utters not one word, overhauled al-Qaeda's logistics, communications, and financial networks and was given responsibilities in international liaisons, such as relations with the Hezbollah or the Sudanese National Islamic Front. To facilitate financial and communications needs, he designed a new secure encrypted web-based communication system for al-Qaeda. There was talk he would one day succeed bin Laden. Over and above all these responsibilities, Syed Sheikh had another extremely sensitive job for al-Qaeda. He was the group's principal liaison with the ISI, working with various and current former officers of Pakistani intelligence, including Lieutenant General Muhammad Aziz Khan, who after Pervez Musharraf himself was the most powerful army commander in Pakistan. Syed Sheikh played a vital role in the 9/11 plot by financing the hijackers. For his trouble, he received the same personal budget as the two other key coordinators, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shib. As the 9/11 attacks neared, the ISI chief, General Ahmed, became more deeply mired in the plot, apparently to secure new sources of funds for the airline tickets needed for the reconnaissance flights and the flights on the date of the attack. In early August, Syed's former prison mates kidnapped a wealthy shoe tycoon in India and held him for 15 days. The chief gangster, Mr. Ansari, ran the kidnapping operation right from Dubai, United Arab Emirates, right where Saeed Sheikh was carrying out his 9/11 paymaster duties. The kidnappers freed their hostage for $830,000 and gave $100,000 to Saeed Sheikh. In an email discovered afterwards, Ansari said, "I've paid $100,000 to Sheikh." On the orders of the ISI chief, General Ahmed, Saeed Sheikh then wired the money to the hijacker leader, Mohammed Atta. Flush with cash, Atta, Hamzi, and Hanjour each flew first class on the type of aircraft they would use on 9/11. Now I'll turn to the Commission report and what U.S. intelligence did with this in the hours and days right after the 9/11 attacks. In the appendix of names at the back of the 9/11 Commission report, there is a Sheikh Saeed al-Marsi, listed as an Egyptian and finance chief of al-Qaeda. Al-Marsi is simply a common code name used by many al-Qaeda operatives, and of course, Sheikh Saeed is a transposition of the name Saeed Sheikh, about whom the report says nothing. In Chapter 2, which describes the al-Qaeda leadership in detail from 1988 to 1998, there is no mention of this Sheikh Saeed al-Marsi, the alleged Egyptian finance chief of al-Qaeda. Chapters 5 and 6 pick up the history of al-Qaeda again, as plans were honed for a major attack on the U.S. mainland, but despite the many, many names mentioned and discussed, nowhere was this reputed finance chief Sheikh Saeed mentioned. Besides the entry in the index of names, this Sheikh Saeed is mentioned only one time in the 9/11 final report. He pops up out of nowhere just 6 weeks before the attack and is identified only as al-Qaeda's finance chief and is said to have been in a handful of senior al-Qaeda leaders who opposed the attack. He's never mentioned again, probably because he's a ghost of our Saeed Sheikh. The 9/11 Commission, which studied U.S. intelligence and law enforcement community performance in great detail, maybe not so much great detail, but they did, neglected to cover the community's performance during the weeks following the attacks to determine who was responsible for them. Not a word about that in the report. The report does discuss the immediate U.S. responses, but the immediate investigation is never addressed. And anyone who has closely studied the post-9/11 investigation knows that the first breakthrough came 2 weeks into the investigation when the money transfers from the United Arab Emirates to the hijackers were uncovered. Furthermore, if you have studied that investigation, you know there is no disputing that while investigators may have struggled with the identity of the paymaster, they were clear about one thing: he was al-Qaeda's finance chief. For this reason alone, you have to ask why the 9/11 Commission report never mentions the finance chief's role in the 9/11 paymaster, as the 9/11 paymaster. The 9/11 Commission staff was not brain dead. They likely left this out because of the sensitivity of Saeed Sheikh's story. The investigators learned that most of the late money transfers in the 9/11 operation were linked to an alias that Saeed Sheikh had used, Mustafa Ahmed al-Hassawi. But U.S. investigators did not yet know this was his alias. So the game to find out who Hassawi was afoot, and the first person they suspected was announced on September 24th. We'll call him Mustafa number 1, Mustafa Ahmad. On September 28th, a senior government official told the press that the U.S. is seeking this Egyptian-born terrorist named Mustafa Mahmoud Saeed Ahmed, whose past had included money transfers to bin Laden. 3 days later, they dropped him from the investigation. We found out why on October 1st, when U.S. investigators announced that they had found the smoking gun, and there's a nice place on the website of the timeline if you'd like to look for more here. They found the smoking gun linking bin Laden to the 9/11 attacks. The FBI told many media outlets the 9/11 paymaster was Sheikh Saeed, an Egyptian, also known as Mustafa Muhammad Ahmed. We'll call him Mustafa number 2. And that he was also known as Sheikh Saeed. The FBI said it was he who had transferred the money to Mohammed Atta in the days leading up to the attack, and that he was a senior financial manager for bin Laden and had been in that capacity since his days in the Sudan. This is exactly what the United States needed to make an ironclad case proving bin Laden's guilt. So they were very pleased with themselves, and they announced that they had found the smoking gun linking bin Laden to the attacks. They had indeed found the smoking gun, but had no idea of the bombshell they would uncover 1 week later. Then Mustafa Muhammad Ahmad, like Mustafa Mahmoud Saeed Ahmed before him, were dropped as the Dubai paymaster, and the 9/11 Commission does not mention either of those names in the extensive list of those connected to the plot. At the end of the first week of October, an FBI team investigating the 9/11 attacks made a startling breakthrough. The first details emerged in CNN's coverage. The investigation now identified Mustafa Ahmed al-Hassawi as our Saeed Sheikh, the man released from prison in India less than 2 years ago after hijackers of an Indian Airlines flight demanded his freedom. The sources for the CNN story were said to be senior-level U.S. government sources and U.S. investigators. 2 days later, on October 8th, CNN followed up the story reporting, quote, Indian and U.S. authorities now see a link between the 1999 Indian Airlines Flight H-14 hijacking and the September 11th attacks in the United States. Freed was Ahmed Umar Saeed Sheikh, whom authorities say used the pseudonym to wire $100,000 to suspected hijacker Mohammed Atta, and who then distributed the money in the United States. But there was more. An FBI team working with cell phone numbers provided by Indian intelligence uncovered a new smoking gun. They learned that the chief of the ISI, Mahmoud Ahmed, had ordered Saeed Sheikh to send $100,000 of the kidnapping ransom to Mohammed Atta a month before the 9/11 attack. This ugly detail emerged when the FBI team ran traces on Saeed Sheikh's cell phone number. Beginning in July, the ISI chief's number was among the regular people that Saeed Sheikh communicated. On October 7th, President Musharraf sacked Ahmed for this nefarious act. This story was widely covered in the press around the world, not covered here in the United States. One piece was added on October 9th that Musharraf had done this at the behest of the U.S. authorities, which asked for his removal after they confirmed the role of the money transfer to Atta. This bombshell could not have come at a worse time. Washington and London were preparing to invade Afghanistan while securing Pakistan as an ally. It's hard to imagine a revelation more damaging than the fact that Pakistan's intelligence service and most powerful army commanders were behind the 9/11 attack and the paymaster, a known terrorist who had been able to carry out his mission because the U.S. and U.K. had set aside justice for his crimes. More than the ISI chief had been involved in Pakistan, the investigation established that there were other generals, Aziz Khan and others, and I'm going to skip over that because I'm out of time. It's now clear that these Islamist generals who had installed Musharraf in the 1999 coup were behind Saeed Sheikh. Musharraf fired them all the same day, October 7th, the day after Saeed Sheikh's links to them were discovered. That a sovereign government and supposed ally was so directly involved in the 9/11 atrocity must have stunned and deeply embarrassed the American administration. It was as politically damaging for Prime Minister Tony Blair as Pakistan's role was for Pervez Musharraf. The stakes in Pakistan were very high, as U.S. General Anthony Zinni explained to CBS 60 Minutes. Musharraf may be America's last hope in Pakistan, and if he fails, the fundamentalists would get hold of the Islamic bomb. Musharraf was also vital to the war effort and was the key to neutralizing Islamists and rounding up al-Qaeda operatives in Pakistan. The story of Saeed Sheikh and the general is only lightly covered in Western media, and only one American newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, carried it on October 10th. One wonders if this didn't put the Wall Street Journal on the ISI's radar screen. Remember the story of Daniel Pearl a few weeks later. Not a single other American outlet carried the story, and the role of Saeed Sheikh and the generals in the 9/11 attack disappeared in the American and British media. Prominent outlets, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, the BBC, and the Sunday Times still carried the story that the paymaster was an Egyptian. Asian media, however, bored in on the story of Saeed Sheikh and the generals and prodded the West, asking why there was so little pressure to hand him over. And there would be no pressure to do so until after Pearl was murdered 4 months later. Pearl discovered that senior Pakistani scientists were helping bin Laden acquire nuclear know-how. For his part, Saeed Sheikh didn't seem worried about it. He returned in October to Lahore and again partied with government leaders. The American media, wholly dependent on U.S. government sources, seemed not to notice. In the middle of November, the U.S. government suddenly dropped his Egyptian identity and claimed he was a Saudi businessman. Where did that come from? From a British source, 2 oblique references to another Ahmed in a Dublin charity link to al-Qaeda. And with that, the story died. This dubious fourth version underpinned the separation of Saeed Sheikh from the astonishing story of his rise to power in al-Qaeda and his shadowy but crucial role in the 9/11 plot. But a noticeable facet of this fourth version is that the paymaster was still the CFO of al-Qaeda. The 9/11 Commission report, which carries Mustafa al-Hassawi as the paymaster and Sheikh Saeed as the al-Qaeda CFO, has dodged the issue and does not say if the two are the same or not. Thus, technically, even if the Commission staff knew the truth, they have not told a bald lie.
John?
By not addressing the issue, however, the Commission leaves the impression that both men are real, which helps to perpetuate the suppression of Saeed Sheikh's story. Saeed Sheikh from 9/11 and al-Qaeda, U.S. authorities had no intention of letting him get off scot-free. In mid-November, at the very moment he went from prominence to obscurity, the United States finally but secretly indicted Saeed Sheikh for the 1994 kidnapping of American India. The indictment will only be revealed in late February 2002.
Excuse me, John, we're going to have to ask you to wrap up very briefly.
3 sentences to go.
Okay, thank you.
One might be, let's see, the indictment would, let's see, the administration, then an administration official speaking in terms of anonymity told Agence France Presse that the Justice Department had pressed the National Security Council to have Saeed Sheikh extradited. One might be justified in asking the question, why would the National Security Council have to be pressed to extradite a murderer of U.S. citizens? By late February, the issue was moot. Pearl was murdered, and Musharraf swore he would personally hang him before turning him over to the Americans, unlike Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shib, whom he did turn over. But of course, they had not been Western penetrations of al-Qaeda. So we've learned through the Congresswoman McKinney's office that there was a classified briefing about Saeed Sheikh. While that's comforting, the fact that the rest of the world knows about his role in 9/11 while the American public and most of Congress remains ignorant is disquieting. We can no longer say we're protecting sources and methods about a story known to the rest of this planet. We are now mocked for our ignorance about this story, and even members of Britain's Parliament poke fun at us. It's long past time to come clean about Ahmed.
Okay.
Saeed Sheikh.
Thank you, John. And hopefully you have the complete statement available for the representative staff so that that can be distributed. John? John, you have the complete statement available for the...
Yes, I do with...
okay. All right. So if there's things that you had to leave out, it will be made available. Also, I want to announce that there's going to be a DVD testimony on tape by William Pepper, the author and English barrister and an American lawyer with specialized training in international law and international human rights on this same topic. He convened a seminar on international human rights at Oxford University. That DVD will be aired right here in this room during the lunch break for those who are interested in seeing it. Our next speaker is Marilyn Rosenthal. She is the mother of Josh Rosenthal, who was killed in the attack on the South Tower of the World Trade Center on September 11th. She's currently editing her book, 9/11, Searching for My Son and His Killers. Since her son's death, she has become an expert on warnings about and proceedings the 9/11 attack. She is Professor Emerita, medical sociologist, and adjunct professor in the Department of Internal Medicine at the University of Michigan Medical School. She's also an associate director of the UM Medical School's program in Society and Medicine. Welcome, Ms. Rosenthal.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my research. After my son was killed and we somewhat recovered from the trauma and the shock, my first reaction as a social scientist was to find out as much as I could from as reliable sources as I could. And one of the subjects I was interested in, along with many other members of victims' families, is what information the White House could have had available to it before 9/11. So I'd like to summarize my findings here by telling you a little bit about the 10 different sources of information the White House could have had access to, that the President could have had on his desk in helping understand what was going on in the world. There are 15 United States government intelligence agencies. We've heard a lot about the CIA and the FBI, but there's many more than that, and I want to talk about one of them after I go through the list. We also have documented the information that the White House and various intelligence agencies received from foreign intelligence agencies in a period of time leading up to 9/11. In addition to that, there are the public declarations from Osama bin Laden. There were the transition briefings from the Clinton administration officials. There was information from America's foremost terrorism experts, George Tenet and Richard Clarke. There was information that came through the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. There were unusual activities in the financial markets, and there were thousands of threat warnings in the summer of 2001. Here's a list of the various intelligence, the 15 intelligence agencies that we pay our tax monies for. And we're going to just quickly go through that. And I'd like to just say a few words about the National Security Agency, during this, which monitors electronic messages and telephone calls. During the summer of 2001, the National Security Agency reported at least, that's supposed to be in red there. Mike, we're moving forward. Okay, the NSA reported at least 33 communications that they had intercepted and translated, indicating a possible imminent terrorist attack in 2001. I am wondering if those 33 included the following two. Okay, on August 20th, 2001, Mohammed Atta sent a coded email message to Ramzi Ben El-Sheeb, the handler for the cell here, indicating the approximate time of the attack in 3 weeks and the 4 targets. That was a coded message, and I would presume our coding experts would have been able to figure out what that said. But a little easier to figure out was a telephone message from Atta to Ramzi on August 29th, 2001, indicating the date of the attack. And the code in that was so simple that my 12-year-old granddaughter could figure it out immediately, and it was 11/9. And that's a European way of writing a date, 9/11. That information is from a book called Masterminds of Terror, which was written by 2 British journalists and is based on interviews with Ramzi and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed before they were captured in Pakistan. In addition, we can look very quickly at the foreign sources of intelligence concerning imminent attacks. All my material, by the way, is from the public sector, and any of you with persistence can find all this. In the late summer of 2001, there were specific messages from Britain, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, the governments or intelligence agencies or heads of governments, and interestingly enough, from a secret Taliban emissary from Afghanistan. I don't know what to make of that. And warning of an imminent attack. There was additional intelligence information in the decade before, and particularly the year before, from all of those intelligence agencies. Then when we turn to government reports, some of which have been mentioned here, there were 8 government reports between 1994 and the last one in 2001. The first one in 1994 was, for example, called Terrorism 2000, the future face of terrorism. And of course, the 2001 report was the Hart-Rudman report on counterterrorism. The majority of these reports, beginning with the 1994 report, indicate possible scenarios where terrorists would hijack airplanes and crash them into American landmarks. So if the President had wished, he could have had a good deal of information from those 8 reports. Then just let's look at statements from Osama bin Laden. Okay. Between 1993 and April 2001, Osama bin Laden gave 26 televised interviews with British and American and foreign correspondents in the Middle East. And he gave 26 televised interviews or made public statements that contained threat warnings. Between December 1992 and September 9, Al-Qaeda carried out 9 bombings, assassinations, and attempted assassinations. Then, of course, I'm going to go over the material quite quickly concerning statements made by the Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet. Let me just read a few of these. From 1995, quote, from 1995 to 9/11, we produced 46 papers I would call significant strategic intelligence analysis on bin Laden, al-Qaeda, and Islamic extremists. During 2000 and 2001, we pushed our analytic products, into broader circulation. The leadership of the CIA repeatedly warned the policy community in the executive branch in Congress of the seriousness of the threat, and he went on to give some specific examples. You all know about the presidential briefing, and you may have missed an interesting quote from George Tenet at 8:50 on 9/11. He was having breakfast with former Senator Boren in the Sheraton Hotel. An aide informed him that the World Trade Center had been attacked, and Tenet's response was, "This has the fingerprints of bin Laden all over it." Then, of course, there's the second renowned American terrorism expert, Richard Clarke. And these are quotes taken from his book. He talked about the difference between the Clinton administration and the Bush administration in terms of the priorities they gave to terrorism, their emphasis on terrorism. And there was also his January 25th, 2001 memo to Condoleezza Rice, which was only just released a short time ago, which contained explicit warnings. And he is quoted as saying, in the summer of 2001, the threat level exceeded anything George Tenet and I had ever seen, and it took until September 4th to get the Principals Committee meeting on al-Qaeda that he had requested urgently in the January 25th memo. And I have to read aloud a statement that Richard Clarke made on 60 Minutes on March 21st, 2004, because it expresses exactly how I feel. Frankly, quote, "Frankly, I find it outrageous that the President is running for re-election on the grounds that he is doing such great things about terrorism. He ignored it for months when maybe we could have done something to stop 9/11. Maybe. We'll never know." Then there was information that was available from the FAA. Security breaches at airports have been known and documented and reported on for decades. There's nothing new in that subject area. And it's already been stated that between April and September 10th, the FAA had received 52 separate intelligence reports specifically mentioning al-Qaeda threats to domestic airlines. They distributed 15 security flyers that included mention of Osama bin Laden hijacking and attacks in the United States. You've already heard the final quote. We also know that in the several months before 9/11, there were 30 cockpit intrusions on American commercial airlines. There's a lot to be said about that. And I see my time is running short, and I'm going to continue for a little bit more. There's been a lot of interest in activities in the financial markets, and all of you know about the unusual spikes in put orders in the options market on American and unusual airlines, unusual short sells on reinsurance companies that held insurance on buildings in the World Trade Center. There was also unusual purchases of Treasury notes and unusual surges in currency flow. Now, one of the staff reports, which was published sometime after the 9/11 Commission report, did go into great detail on the SEC investigation of activities in the financial markets. And I am, the research is impressive and persuasive in terms of the activity that went on in the American market. And the evidence persuades me that it was not related to al-Qaeda. But there, and that was the point, that the staff made, that there's no evidence that Al-Qaeda was involved in any of the manipulations in in American financial markets. However, there are questions that remain. The SEC examined 9.5 million transactions. That sounds like a lot until you calculate the number of transactions that go on in a week's period of time. So all we know is that they looked at transactions for the weeks before 9/11. So if I checked that out and included the weeks of August through September 9th, and that represents 17.6% of all the transactions. So we have to ask some questions about their methodology. Furthermore, they depended on the word of overseas sources, and they claim they were unable to check that. They indicate difficulty in investigating offshore and shell companies. Nobody has explained why the president of the German National Bank, speaking publicly a number of times in the week after 9/11, why such a person would suggest insider trading in, quote, airline and insurance stocks and gold and oil futures. The staff reasoned that only Al-Qaeda could have been the source of such insider trading. I think we have to ask some questions about the possibility of other individuals who might have been hidden Al-Qaeda supporters or others with access to this intelligence, particularly from overseas. And of course, we just have to ask, how are our financial markets actually protected?
Ms. Rosenthal, I think that's
okay. Let me just let me just show one more slide. And
okay, we have about one more minute, and then we're going to have to go to the question.
Let's go to the categories and overall distributions of the threat warnings. Okay. With some graduate students helping me, we collected from what we considered to be responsible sources as many of the threat warnings as we could find on the web, in newspapers, from reliable books. And among the thousands of threat warnings we collected, we found 144 unique threat warnings, because there's a lot of repetition of these, and we were able to categorize these in a variety of ways, and you can see from the chart what we found. It turns out that 21% of the unique warnings, 21% of the unique warnings were about terrorists hijacking planes and crashing them into buildings and American landmarks. I am willing to make an assessment. I have a number of quotes from various individuals here that you have all heard, but my final assessment is this. 9/11 could have been prevented. You can move forward to this mic. It's toward the end. 9/11 could have been prevented or at least contained. There was enough specificity in the pre-9/11 information to institute these security steps: harden cockpit doors and tighten airport security. Okay. And I thank you very much for indulging me.
All right. Thank you very much. And I just want to, yes, indeed. There is indeed so much information and so little time. Unfortunately, the Commission did not air this information, which is why we're holding these briefings today. I want to let everyone know that this session, this briefing is online streaming as we speak. Also, a DVD will be available of this briefing later, and an online posting will be available later at www.house.gov/McKinney. We're going to move now briefly to the question and answer segment, and I'm going to urge you to please keep your questions very brief and concise, and your responses as well, so we can get to our final panel before lunch, which is scheduled at 1. Okay, let's begin with Mike Rupert. Mike.
Brief procedural issue. Since you've combined two panels, we have lost one question per questioner. If I ask very short, brief questions, may I get the two questions, one from the first panel that you've combined into this one? And they will be very short.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, it's a great panel. I know most of you, I haven't met you, Marilyn. Dr. Newman, very familiar with your work on JFK in Mexico City. Good job. You three guys and I have presented a number of times, and I salute you. My first question, I'll direct it first to John Newman, but then the other guys can jump in. To summarize the Ballad of Omar Saeed Sheikh, which I'll call it the Ballad of Omar Saeed Sheikh, basically we have a guy who was a Pakistani ISI asset, we'll call him that, who, on orders of General Mahmoud Ahmad, the head of the Pakistani ISI, wired $100,000 to Mohammed Atta shortly before the 9/11 attacks. Thanks to Professor Michel Chossudovsky of Canada, who's written extensively on this and talked about it, we know that the head of the Pakistani ISI is de facto approved by the DCI here in the United States, Director of Central Intelligence, and there's a close ongoing relationship. Also, Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, who is a colleague of Congresswoman McKinney's in open hearings, which I have quoted in my book, Crossing the Rubicon, documented extensively that the Pakistani ISI was used by the United States government, specifically the CIA, to arm the Mujahideen and the roots of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, especially in the years leading up to 2001. I and many others have drawn the conclusion that Omar Saeed Sheikh and General Ahmad wired this $100,000, could not have wired this $100,000 to Mohammed Atta without the approval, if you will, of the Director of Central Intelligence and the U.S. National Security Establishment. How do you feel about that?
I don't know. I just really don't have a feel for that. I just know that we were mindless in our approach to the ISI in Pakistan, not just at 9/11, but going all the way back into the 80s. It was proliferation, and counter-narcotics was always the excuse why we had to look the other way. And of course, they were proliferating like crazy and doing nothing at all to stop narcotics. So it was a failed policy. But if you look at the State Department, the story there, and the White House initiatives, they did whatever they wanted to, and we blessed it. So whether or not Tenet was intimately involved every day with every decision, I can't address that. I just don't know.
All right. Nafis, do you have a feel on that?
I won't answer you directly, but what I will do is refer you to a few interesting things that I've mentioned in my book. One report that I read, this guy he's British. In 1998 to 99, there was a report in one of the British press that Ahmed Omar Sheikh Saeed was offered amnesty by the British security services that, if you come to the UK, obviously we'll have to arrest you, but if you work with us as an informant, then you can live in London as a free man. Subsequently, he was seen in between 2000 and 2001 by people who recognized people who knew him before he actually went on to join Al-Qaeda. He was seen in those months several times. He had come in and out of the UK. And the government's response, as John mentioned, was to the outrage of the victims' families in the 1994 hijackings that he'd participated in, was, how could the government allow this to happen? This guy should have been arrested and prosecuted, and the response of the government was decidedly inadequate. Well, he hasn't been tried and convicted. Well, maybe that's what we should do in Britain. And the question remains as to what is his connection to the British government in that respect. The facts seem to suggest that he did go on to join and agree to the amnesty, which calls into question his relationship to the intelligence services and raises the issue. And there are a number of reports to this effect about Ahmed Omar Sheikh, which are very disturbing.
Okay. Let me move very quickly into my second question. Paul, early on you referenced the war games. Now, in Crossing the Rubicon, of course, I've done a detailed analysis of 3 field training exercise war games and two command post exercises that were taking place on 9/11, which effectively paralyzed NORAD response. We had Northern Vigilance moving a large number of U.S. fighters out of the Northeast Air Defense Sector at a time of heightened danger, very specific warnings. We have documented war game live fly drills taking place thanks to CNN and USA Today. Since the publication of my book, I have confirmed an additional exercise, Northern Guardian, which I only mentioned in passage, which also had moved fighters to Iceland and Greenland on the day of 9/11. And as many as 22 false radar injects inserted onto the Northeast Air Defense Sector radar screens. In light of the fact that in May of 2001, a White House order placed all wargame exercises under the direct control of the Vice President, Richard Cheney, and his office, who had responsibility for scheduling all wargame exercise, how would you categorize the scheduling of now 5 separate, conflicting, overlapping wargame exercises on September the 11th, which paralyzed FAA and the Northeast Air Defense Sector? Would you call that an accident, or could you call that an accident?
Well, I think that's a very important issue, and one I've been looking into a lot lately. I'm about to publish an essay on the internet that I co-wrote with another person. It should come out in a week or two on the cooperativeresearch.org website, where we're looking into exactly this question. And following up on your research and other people's research, we found yet more war games. There's another one called Global Guardian that was actually described in one newspaper article as a practice Armageddon. So if you can imagine, on the day of 9/11, that there's a practice Armageddon involving large sectors of the U.S. military, and this is something that has not been commonly reported. And another thing we found that was interesting is that many of these war games seem to be coordinated together, at least in past years. You can see this from a lot of the names. We have Vigilant Guardian, we have Northern Guardian, we have Global Guardian. Obviously, there's a link there. And curiously, in the case of some of these war games, it appears that in past years they had taken place in October, and they were moved to early September in this year, causing seemingly a larger number of war games than was usual to all be taking place at the same time.
In light of the fact that the United States government, we now know, was swimming in detailed warnings about aircraft being hijacked to use as weapons against the World Trade Center, the White House, et cetera, multiple targets. We were swimming in threat warnings at that time, specific ones. Does it make sense to you that these 5, 6, however many now, war game exercises would have been scheduled so as to weaken the response capabilities of NORAD, or Northeast Air Defense Sector, at that time?
Yeah, of course not. In fact, fact I find very interesting, which was mentioned in the New York Times and seems to have missed most people, is that in early July, Richard Clark and Condoleezza Rice were in a meeting, and one of the things that came out of that meeting was that they directed the FBI, the CIA, and the Pentagon to prepare for 3 to 5 simultaneous terrorist attacks. Now, of course, we know that there were 4 attacks, so that was a pretty good guess. And as far as we know, although they were directed very urgently to do something about this, we have no evidence that they actually did make those types of preparations. Instead, they were going ahead with all these training exercises, in the case of the Pentagon, which, you know, in that time of great extreme danger, just didn't make sense. So I think this is one of the most important issues that we really have to look in great depth.
Okay, Mike, no more questions. You've artfully turned one question into 5, so I'm going to ask for our Wayne Madsen to please honor the one question.
That's right, you can't trust those California guys.
My question is on the financing. I was wondering if any of you have looked into the activities of Russian arms dealer Victor Butt, who was transporting weapons, passengers, providing other air services for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda from his base of operations in the United Arab Emirates.
If I could just interrupt there, I believe I'm on the schedule to speak a second time, and I'm actually going to speak at some considerable length about Victor Butt.
Oh, okay, that's good.
Why don't we save that until the next panel discussion then?
The thing on the other intelligence director who resigned from an agency that was affiliated with Al-Qaeda activities, and he was the head of Saudi intelligence, Prince Turki Al-Faisal, who, by the way, has now been named by Saudi Arabia as the replacement ambassador for Prince Bandar. And he, right now, it looks like the Bush administration, he's going to be allowed to present his credentials to President Bush, but Prince of Turkey had many meetings with bin Laden and Taliban and al-Qaeda leaders. So if anyone could talk about his role in helping to fund, he's denied it, and he sued Paris Match, the French magazine, for libel successfully. But I don't think we have to worry about Saudi lawyers in the United States. So can you say anything about Prince Turkey and what he did, similarly to what Mahmoud Ahmed did with the ISI?
Yeah, I could probably speak to that issue. He was fired. He had been director of the Saudi intelligence agency for something like 25 years, and he was fired about a week before 9/11. And I believe the Wall Street Journal and maybe one or two other newspapers actually speculated that his firing may have been a result of the Saudis having foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks and essentially trying to cut their losses because of his deep involvement with al-Qaeda. So that certainly is one possibility. And there are numerous press reports that suggest that he was visiting bin Laden in Afghanistan a number of times. He was participating in some very important meetings that involved Saudi intelligence and the bin Laden family outside of Osama, where large payments were made, agreements that we're going to send so many hundreds of millions of dollars over the next few years to al-Qaeda, and in return, you promise not to attack Saudi Arabia. So there are all these different things that really need to be addressed, and the many 9/11 relatives have joined this Saudi lawsuit that have named him and many other people as essentially accomplices to the 9/11 plot. Unfortunately, he was taken off of that lawsuit because he has diplomatic immunity as a result of being an ambassador.
I'd like to piggyback on that point, too, that the Crown Prince Abdullah did go to Afghanistan in early May to try and argue the case for not conducting attacks on the United States from Afghanistan. And I don't have time to go into the details of that, but if you look closely at that, I've always had the sneaking feeling, looking at the material, or what we do know about it, that it betrayed an early knowledge that the Saudis may have had of the attack.
I'd first like to thank people who compile reconstructions and chronologies without which analysis and conclusions are not possible. Prince Turkey, has he not just been announced as the new ambassador here in Washington?
I guess so.
Yeah, yesterday. Wow. In view of what's just been said here. Let me just direct one question, a brief one, to Dr. Rosenthal, whose presentation I really appreciated. The question has to do with this wonderful quote about George Tenet, the fingerprints of bin Laden being all over this. What is your source for that? Do you remember?
I have a slide that lists all my sources.
Okay.
That's totally unreadable. I will give you my card.
Well, we can get together later. I hope it was Michael. Well, if it was Michael Gettler, then that's my source. I've written about this. If it was someone else, that would be a nice confirmation.
My recollection is that it was from the Washington Post.
Yeah, okay, it was Michael Gettler. In our business, we have to be careful about false confirmation, okay?
Sure.
Let me tell you why I think that's important. He also said, that is, George Tenet, having breakfast with his patron, Senator Boren, as George Tenet is interrupted by one of his aides saying what had happened at buildings up in New York, he is quoted as saying, this has the fingerprints of Osama bin Laden all over it, and I wonder if that fellow taking flight training is involved. Now, why is that important? That is important because it shows me that George Tenet was fully briefed, fully informed about Moussaoui, and that as night follows the day, the President of the United States was fully informed about Moussaoui as well, because George Tenet was keeping him up to date on all this. And so the thing that has been prohibited from us knowing, i.e., the role of the President of the United States and the Vice President, what the President and the Vice President knew before 9/11, not covered in the Joint Committee report, not covered in the 9/11 Commission report, never covered. It's never covered, not even with respect to the commissions on Iraq. We know, at least from Michael Gettler in the Post, if that quote is correct, that Tenet knew that this was Osama bin Laden's operation, and he also knew about Moussaoui taking flight training in Minneapolis. And as I say, we can't be 100% sure, but I think it's a fair guess. It's a very good guess that the President knew chapter and verse about that and did nothing.
Now, in fairness, I would like to contrast it with a quote when the President was told that the first plane had hit, I believe by Andrew Card when he was in Sarasota about to enter the elementary school. Okay? And this is from the Sarasota Herald Tribune. What he's quoted is responding, okay, and I haven't double-checked this as I have the Tennant quote. He was told that a plane hit the World Trade Center. The aide to Tennant said, the World Trade Center has been attacked by a plane. Okay? And the President's response, if the quote is accurate, okay, is that, wow, bad pilot.
I would maybe add that in the 9/11 Commission report, there is a little bit of discussion, although they didn't interview Colleen Rowley separately from the Joint Committee or the other people in Minnesota, but using their material, the focus on Moussaoui fit within that framework of knowing what it was about, because at one point a supervisor was berated by someone at headquarters. They don't name people in most places. FBI headquarters says to the Minnesota supervisor, "You're just trying to get people all stirred up," when they wanted to look at Moussaoui's materials. And he said, "Yes, I am, because I'm afraid that he's going to run a plane into the Twin Towers." Then they sent a memo to CIA on the same issue to look for him abroad, and the CIA memo alerted them, saying that we have reason to suspect that this person may be a suicide hijacker. Now, this is all prior to 9/11. Suicide hijacker is a pretty interesting term to take prior to 9/11.
Yeah, well, the way they found out about Moussaoui's terrorist ties was by doing an end run around the bureaucracy. The people in Minnesota had to go to the folks they knew at headquarters in Langley, CIA headquarters, asked them to send a cable out to the field of Paris. And through liaison there in Paris, CIA got the answer that yes, he was tied. And George Tenet was drawing on that information when he made that comment. So a lot was known and a lot was told, and there's no acknowledgement whatever in the 9/11 report about that.
Can we give our panelists a hand here? We are, in the interest of time, and in as much as your thirst for knowledge and this information has required us to make a slight adjustment in our schedule. Rather than take a full hour break for lunch, we're going to break now. We will return here by 1 o'clock, which is basically a 10 or 15-minute break. If there are light refreshments in the back, and if the panelists would like to join the Congresswoman in 320 Cannon for a brief time, feel free to do so. When we return, we will just roll through the rest of the day, and we'll begin with the discussion with Loretta Napoleoni, Peter Dale Scott, Nafez Ahmed, and Ann Norton. Thank you all very much.
Great. Let me give you my card, too.
Sorry. Got it in.
Right now? Okay. No.
I have a copy for you.
Okay.
Various other people.